Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of history, into stories the church desperately wanted us to forget. Imagine a woman so powerful, so wealthy, that when they locked her in a stone cell the night before her execution, she simply vanished. No keys, no guards bribed, just gone. Her name was Alice Keteler, and in 1324 she became Ireland's first woman condemned for witchcraft. But here's the twist that'll keep you awake. While Alice disappeared into the night like smoke, her maid was dragged screaming to the stake and burned alive. Tonight, we're uncovering why the church tried so desperately to erase this woman from history, and why her story matters more than ever. So before we dive into Alice's world, I need a small favour. If you're settling in for the night, maybe propped up on your pillows with the lights low, take just a moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But only if you genuinely enjoy what we're exploring together. I want this to feel authentic, not forced. And hey, I'm curious. Where are you watching from right now? London? New York? Somewhere in New Zealand where it's already tomorrow? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is for you. There's something beautiful about all of us gathering from different corners of the world to remember these forgotten women. All right, get comfortable. Maybe adjust your fan or pull up that blanket. Let's step back 700 years to medieval Ireland, where cobblestone streets smelled of wood smoke and secrets, and where one woman was about to shake the foundations of the church itself. Picture this. It's the early 1300s in Kilkenny, Ireland, a bustling market town where merchants hawk their wares and the scent of fresh bread mingles with horse manure. And there, walking through the marketplace in fine wool and imported silks, is Alice Keteler. She's not just wealthy, she's impossibly wealthy for a woman of her time. While most women her age are hunched over cooking fires or dying in childbirth, Alice owns property, runs businesses, and commands respect that makes the local men deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Here's where things get interesting. Alice was married 4 times. 4 husbands, all of them dead. Now before you jump to conclusions, let me paint you the full picture. Her first husband lasted 5 years, the second 6 years, the third 7 years, and the fourth 8 years. You see the pattern? It's almost too perfect, too mathematical, like someone was following a very specific plan. The people of Kilkenny certainly noticed. They whispered in taverns and crossed themselves when she walked by. But whispers alone don't make a witch trial. What made Alice's story explosive was what happened when husband number 4 finally died. William Outlaw, her 4th and final husband, spent his last days in agony. We're talking about a man who'd been robust and healthy, suddenly wasting away to nothing. His skin turned grey, his eyes sank into his skull, and in those final delirious moments, he allegedly told anyone who would listen that he'd been poisoned, that his own wife had been slowly killing him for months. Can you imagine? Your life slipping away, and the person you trusted most is the one holding the poison. But William's deathbed confession wasn't what really set things in motion. No, the real catalyst came from an unexpected source. Alice's stepchildren. You see, all 4 of her previous husbands had children from earlier marriages, and every single one of them watched as their father's wealth flowed into Alice's coffers instead of their own inheritance. By the time William died, these stepchildren had had enough. They banded together and marched straight to the church authorities with a list of accusations that would make your blood run cold. They claimed Alice wasn't just a poisoner. They said she'd renounced Christ at the crossroads at midnight, that she'd sacrificed red roosters to demons at the edge of town, that she'd been seen meeting with an entity she called Robin Artisan. And here's where it gets wild. This Robin was described as one of the poorer sort of demons, like she couldn't even attract a high-class demon, you know? The medieval equivalent of she's dating beneath her station, except the station in question was literal hell. The church assigned Bishop Richard de Lidry to investigate. Now, Richard was relatively new to Ireland, having just arrived from France, and he was exactly the kind of zealot who saw witchcraft in every shadow. He was ambitious, politically savvy, and he saw Alice Keteler as his ticket to establishing the church's dominance in Ireland. Because here's the thing that often gets forgotten. This wasn't really about witchcraft. This was about power. The church versus the old Anglo-Norman nobility. Male authority versus female autonomy. And Alice, with her wealth and independence, represented everything the church wanted to control. Bishop Richard threw everything at her. The official charges were extensive and theatrical. They accused her of denying Christ, of making sacrifices of 9 red cocks and 9 peacock eyes at crossroads. I mean, where do you even get 9 peacock eyes in medieval Ireland? The charges claimed she'd made ointments in the skull of a beheaded thief, boiled with the entrails of cocks, certain horrible worms, various unspecified herbs, and the nails of dead men's fingers. It's so over the top that even for 1324, people must have raised their eyebrows. But the most damning charge? They said she'd killed her husbands through sorcery to inherit their wealth. And in medieval society, that was the ultimate crime. A woman accumulating power through the deaths of men. It threatened the entire social order. If women could do this, what else might they be capable of? Here's where the story gets truly heartbreaking. While the church was building its case against Alice, they arrested her household servants, and the main target? A woman named Petronella de Meath, Alice's personal maid. Now Petronella was everything Alice wasn't. Poor, powerless, with no noble connections to protect her. She was the perfect scapegoat. They tortured Petronella. Medieval torture wasn't the Hollywood version with dramatic confessions. It was systematic, bureaucratic, horrifying. They used techniques specifically designed to break a person's will without killing them too quickly. We're talking about the strappado, where they'd tie your hands behind your back and hoist you up by your wrists until your shoulders dislocated. Sleep deprivation, starvation, the rack, where they'd stretch your body until joints separated, hour after hour, day after day, until you'd confess to absolutely anything they wanted you to say. And Petronella confessed. She told them everything they wanted to hear. Yes, Alice was a witch. Yes, she'd participated in demonic rituals. Yes, she'd seen Alice meeting with Robin Artisan, who appeared sometimes as a cat, sometimes as a shaggy dog, and sometimes as a black man, accompanied by 2 tall companions. She confirmed every lurid detail the Inquisitors suggested, because at a certain point you'll say whatever makes the pain stop. On November the 3rd, 1324, Petronella de Meath became the first person in Ireland to be burned alive for witchcraft. They dragged her to the stake in the centre of Kilkenny, tied her to the post, and set the kindling ablaze. The crowd watched as the flames consumed her. Historical accounts say she maintained her confession even at the end, but honestly, after what they'd done to her, she probably didn't know what was real anymore. And Alice? Alice never stood trial. See, while the church was focused on torturing Petronella, Alice was using her wealth and connections. She had powerful friends, including some who had the ear of the English crown. She managed to delay her trial multiple times. And then, the night before she was finally scheduled to be executed, something extraordinary happened. She vanished. The official records are frustratingly vague. Alice Keteler simply disappeared from her locked cell in Kilkenny Castle. no broken locks, no bribed guards confessing, no tunnel discovered. One night she was there, facing certain death, and the next morning the cell was empty. The church and local authorities were absolutely humiliated. They'd made this enormous public spectacle, executed her servant, and their main target had slipped through their fingers like water. The most widely accepted theory is that she fled to England, possibly to London, where she had trading connections and where her noble status might offer some protection. But here's the kicker. We never hear about Alice Kittler again. Not one single documented appearance, no death record, no property transactions under her name, nothing. It's as if she stepped out of that cell and out of history entirely. Some historians love to romanticize this as proof of her innocence, like divine intervention saved her. But let's be real for a moment. What Alice's escape really proves is how deeply unjust the medieval legal system was. She survived not because she was innocent, but because she was wealthy and well-connected. Meanwhile, Petronella, who was almost certainly innocent, died screaming because she had neither wealth nor connections to save her. This is the part that keeps me up at night, honestly. We remember Alice's name. There are books about her, historical tours in Kilkenny dedicated to her, academic papers analysing her case. But Petronella, she's barely a footnote. The woman who actually suffered, who actually died, is the one history tried hardest to forget. Even in a story about witches the church tried to erase, we have to fight to remember the real victim. Alice's case set a terrifying precedent for Ireland and Britain. It established that the church could prosecute witchcraft, that torture was an acceptable means of extracting confessions, and that anyone associated with an accused witch was also in danger. Over the next 400 years, thousands of people, mostly women, would face similar accusations. And like Petronella, most of them were poor, elderly, or otherwise vulnerable. But here's why Alice's story still matters in 2025. Strip away the medieval language about demons and familiars, and what you're left with is a story that's painfully familiar. A successful woman who doesn't conform to societal expectations becomes threatening. The system targets her using whatever tools are available. In 1324 it was witchcraft, but the mechanics are the same, and when the powerful are threatened, they'll sacrifice the powerless to maintain control. Think about modern parallels. How many women today face professional or personal destruction because they're too successful, too outspoken, too independent? How often do we see powerful people escape consequences while their assistants, their subordinates, their less connected associates take the fall? Alice walked free while Petronella burned, and that same dynamic plays out in courtrooms and boardrooms every single day. The church tried to erase Alice Kittler by making her disappear into legend and superstition. They wanted her story to serve as a warning. This is what happens to women who step outside their prescribed roles. But 700 years later, we're still talking about her. We're still asking questions. We're still recognizing the injustice. And maybe, just maybe, we're finally starting to remember Petronella too. So as you drift off tonight, think about this. How many other Alice Kittlers are out there? How many women had their stories deliberately erased because they threatened the status quo? And how many Petronellas died unnamed and unremembered, collateral damage in someone else's escape? Alice Kittler's story is just the beginning. Because if a wealthy, well-connected noblewoman could barely escape with her life, imagine what happened to women who had nothing. In our next part, we'll meet one of the most famous women in history, a teenage girl who heard voices, led an army, and was burned at the stake by the very institution that would later declare her a saint. Her name was Joan of Arc, and her story will show you just how far the church would go to destroy a woman who dared to claim divine authority. Stay with me, because Joan's story is one you won't want to miss. From a woman who vanished into the night, we now turn to someone who couldn't escape, someone whose death was so public, so deliberate, that 500 years later, the very church that killed her had to admit they'd made a mistake. Picture a 19-year-old girl standing in chains before a panel of church officials. She's wearing men's clothing, a tunic and hose, which in 1431 is considered evidence of demonic possession. Her hair is cropped short like a soldier's. For months she's been locked in a cell, guarded by English soldiers who've tried to assault her multiple times. She's exhausted, malnourished, and facing a tribunal of over 40 educated men whose sole purpose is to find her guilty of heresy and witchcraft. And yet, when they ask her to renounce the voices she's been hearing since age 13, she looks them straight in the eye and refuses. Her name is Joan of Arc, and in about 2 weeks, they're going to burn her alive in the marketplace of Rouen. But here's the twist that makes this story so infuriating. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, the exact same Catholic Church that condemned her as a witch declared her a saint. How does that happen? How do you go from she's possessed by demons to actually she was blessed by God? Well, grab your pillow and settle in, because Joan's story is a masterclass in how the church weaponized witchcraft accusations against women who threatened male power. Let's rewind to 1412 in the tiny village of Domremy in northeastern France. Jeanne, or Jeanne as she was actually called, was born into a peasant family during one of the worst periods in French history. The 100 Years' War had been raging for decades. English forces occupied huge swathes of France. The French king, Charles VII, hadn't even been properly crowned because the English controlled Reims, where French kings were traditionally coronated. France was literally losing its identity as a nation. Now, when Joan was 13, right around puberty, which the church would later use against her, she started hearing voices. She described them as coming from saints, St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. These weren't gentle, comforting voices. They gave her specific military and political instructions. They told her she needed to go to the Dauphin, the uncrowned prince, and convince him to let her lead an army to lift the siege of Orléans and escort him to Reims for his coronation. Can you imagine being a teenage peasant girl and thinking, yeah, I'm going to command an army? But here's what's fascinating. Joan didn't just hear voices and follow them blindly. Historical records show she was incredibly strategic. When she finally got an audience with Charles in 1429, she reportedly told him something in private that convinced him she was legitimate. Historians still debate what she said, but whatever it was, it worked. This uncrowned prince, desperate and out of options, gave a 17-year-old girl armour and troops, and then, and this is the part that still gives military historians chills, she won. The siege of Orléans had lasted 7 months. Professional military commanders had failed to break it. Joan arrived in April 1429, and within 9 days the siege was lifted. 9 days. She didn't do it through some miracle or magic. She did it through morale and tactical audacity. She understood that the French troops had lost hope, and she gave it back to them. She led from the front, took an arrow through the shoulder, pulled it out herself, and went right back to fighting. Over the next few months, Joan won battle after battle. She wasn't just a mascot or a symbol. She was actively involved in military planning. In July 1429, she stood beside Charles VII in Reims Cathedral as he was crowned king, exactly as her voices had told her. She was 18 years old and had completely changed the course of the 100 Years' War. So why did they burn her? Here's where the story gets dark. Joan's success made a lot of powerful men very uncomfortable. First, there were the English, who were losing a war they'd been winning because of one teenage girl. But more importantly, there were the French nobles and church officials who couldn't accept that a peasant girl, a woman, was succeeding where they'd failed. Joan didn't play by the rules. She dressed like a man, which was considered cross-dressing and therefore sinful. She claimed direct communication with God, which bypassed the church's authority, and she commanded men, which violated every social norm of medieval society. In May 1430, during an assault on Compiègne, Joan was thrown from her horse and captured by Burgundian forces, French nobles who were allied with the English. And here's the kicker that still makes historians angry. King Charles VII, the man she'd literally put on the throne, didn't pay her ransom. He abandoned her. The Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 francs, about $60,000 in today's money. Think about that. The girl who'd saved France was sold like livestock. The English knew they couldn't just execute Joan for military reasons. That would make her a martyr and a political prisoner. So they did something more insidious. They handed her over to the church for a heresy trial. They were going to prove that Charles's coronation was illegitimate because it had been secured through witchcraft and devil worship. If Joan was a witch, then everything she'd accomplished was demonic, and Charles's claim to the throne was invalid. The trial began in January 1431 in Rouen and lasted 5 months. It was a show trial from the start. The chief judge was Pierre Cochon, and yes, that surname basically means pig in French, which feels appropriate. A French bishop who was firmly in the English camp. The tribunal consisted of over 40 clerics, all men, all determined to find her guilty. Joan had no legal representation. She was 19 years old, illiterate, and facing some of the most educated minds in Europe, all working together to trap her. But Joan was extraordinary. The trial transcripts still exist, and reading them is like watching someone play chess against impossible odds. They'd ask her trick questions designed to make her contradict herself or blaspheme. They'd ask things like, "Are you in God's grace?" which is a trap question in Catholic theology. If you say yes, you're guilty of presumption. If you say no, you're admitting to sin. Joan's response, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It's such a perfect answer that the judges moved on to other questions. They obsessed over her clothing. They kept coming back to the fact that she wore men's clothes. Joan explained, very reasonably, that she wore armour and male clothing for protection. She was in a military camp surrounded by soldiers, and she'd already fought off multiple assault attempts. Wearing a dress with all those laces would have made her more vulnerable. But the church insisted this was proof of demonic influence. They had a whole theological argument about how God made the distinction between male and female clothing, and violating that distinction was violating God's order. Here's something that'll make your blood boil. During the trial, Joan was held in a secular prison guarded by English soldiers, not in a church prison guarded by women, which was standard for female prisoners accused of religious crimes. The guards repeatedly tried to assault her. She kept her male clothing on as a form of protection. The hose and tunic were harder to remove than a dress. The judges knew this was happening and used her continued wearing of men's clothes as evidence of her guilt. They also interrogated her extensively about her voices. Who did they sound like? When did they come? What did they tell her? Joan described them clearly and consistently, but she also wisely refused to share everything. When they pressed her on what private message she'd given Charles, she said, That is not in your process, meaning that's none of your business. This infuriated them, because it meant she was holding back information, which they interpreted as deception. The trial had a few moments of dark humour, honestly. At one point they asked Joan if she knew whether she was in a state of grace. Remember, the trap question. Later they asked her if she thought the church militant, meaning the earthly church, could err. She responded, "I trust in God." They pushed harder. Would she submit to the church's judgment? She said she'd submit to God and the saints who commanded her. They said, "But we are the church." And Joan, this 19-year-old girl who'd never had formal education, essentially responded, "Well, maybe there's a difference between the church and what you guys are doing right now." In May 1431, the tribunal found her guilty on 12 counts, including heresy, witchcraft, and wearing men's clothing. They threatened her with immediate burning at the stake. Joan, exhausted and terrified, signed a recantation. She agreed to stop wearing men's clothes and to submit to church authority. In exchange, her sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. But then something happened that sealed her fate. A few days later, Joan was wearing men's clothing again. Different accounts give different reasons. Some say her dress was taken away and men's clothes were all that was left. Others say guards attempted to assault her, and she put the protective clothing back on. The church tribunal declared that she'd relapsed into heresy. Under church law, relapsed heretics could not be shown mercy. On May 30th, 1431, they took Joan to the old marketplace in Rouen. They'd built a tall scaffold so everyone could see. They placed a sign above her head that read, "Heretic, relapse, apostate, idolatress." An English cardinal preached a sermon comparing her to a diseased branch that must be cut from the tree. Then they tied her to the stake, piled wood around her, and lit the fire. Most victims of burning were shown a small mercy. They'd be strangled first, so they'd die of suffocation before the flames consumed them. Joan was not granted this mercy. The English ordered the executioner to keep the flames away from her initially, so the smoke wouldn't suffocate her quickly. They wanted her to burn. Witnesses reported that she called out to Jesus and the saints as the flames rose. Some said they saw a dove, a symbol of the Holy Spirit, fly from the flames, which later became evidence of her innocence. The executioner was ordered to rake back the ashes so everyone could see her body, to prove she was really dead and hadn't escaped through witchcraft. Here's the part that still haunts me. Joan's mother, Isabel Romay, spent the next 25 years fighting to clear her daughter's name. This peasant woman, who just lost her child in the most horrific way imaginable, went up against the church and the English government. In 1456, Pope Calixtus III authorized a retrial. The new tribunal overturned all the charges. They declared the original trial had been contaminated by fraud and malice, that Joan had been wrongly executed, and that she died a faithful Catholic. But Joan was still dead. The reversal didn't bring her back. 470 years later, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc as a saint. The girl they'd burned for witchcraft was now officially blessed by God. It's one of history's most glaring examples of institutional hypocrisy. And here's what really gets me. They didn't canonize her for being right about her military campaigns or her visions. They canonized her largely because she'd become a French national symbol, and the church wanted to stay politically relevant. So what was Joan's real crime? Strip away all the theology and legal language, and it's embarrassingly simple. She was a woman who claimed authority that women weren't allowed to have. She led men. She spoke directly to God without priestly intermediaries. She wore pants. In medieval society, these weren't just social violations. They were threats to the entire power structure. If Joan could do all this, what did that say about the men who'd failed to do the same? What did it say about the Church's claim to be the sole conduit to God? Think about the parallels today. How many women leaders are dismissed as hysterical or difficult when they display the same assertiveness that's praised in men? How often do women have to be twice as competent to receive half the recognition? Joan of Arc won battles that professional military commanders couldn't win, and they still found a way to make her the villain. The Church tried to erase Joan by burning her body and condemning her memory. Instead, they created one of history's most enduring martyrs. Joan's story has inspired everyone from Shakespeare to Mark Twain to modern feminists. She's the patron saint of France, of soldiers, of prisoners, of sexual assault survivors. The girl they tried to destroy became immortal. But let's sit with the uncomfortable truth. Joan's canonization doesn't erase the injustice. It's like a company firing someone unfairly and then, 5 centuries later, saying "are bad" and giving them an Employee of the Millennium Award. It doesn't undo the burning. It doesn't give Joan back the life she should have lived. And it doesn't change the fact that the same mechanisms that killed Joan, the fear of powerful women, the weaponizing of religious authority, the punishment of gender nonconformity, are still at work today. As you're drifting off, I want you to think about something. Joan heard voices that told her to do impossible things, and she did them. Whether those voices were divine, psychological, or something else entirely, does it matter? She changed history. She saved a nation, and they killed her for it by calling her a witch. How many other Joans never got the chance because they were silenced first? Speaking of voices and confessions, our next story takes us to Scotland, where a woman gave the most detailed, bizarre, and haunting confession in witchcraft history. Isabel Gowdy described flying through the air, meeting the devil in person, and transforming into animals using specific rhyming chants. She confessed to all of this voluntarily, without torture, in minute detail. Was she mentally ill? A storyteller? Or did she know something we don't? Her story is unlike anything else in the witch trials, and you're not going to want to miss what she said. Stay with me. What if I told you that the most detailed, bizarre, and haunting witch confession in all of history came from a woman who walked into church one day and simply started talking? No torture, no threats, no pressure. She just showed up and said, "I need to tell you about the devil." It's April 13th, 1662, in the tiny Scottish village of Aldern, near the windswept coast of the North Sea. A woman in her 30s or 40s, we don't know exactly how old, approaches the local authorities and announces that she's been a witch for 15 years. Her name is Isabel Gowdy, and over the next 6 weeks she will give 4 separate confessions that include 27 magic chants, detailed descriptions of flying through the air, instructions for transforming into animals, and claims that she's dined with the king and queen of the fairies. Her confessions are so vivid, so specific, so utterly strange that historians are still arguing about them 360 years later. Was she mentally ill? A gifted storyteller? A shamanistic practitioner? Or did she know she was going to die anyway and decided to give them a show they'd never forget? Let's set the scene, because context matters here. Scotland in 1662 was in the grip of what historians call the Great Scottish Witch Hunt. Between the spring of 1661 and autumn of 1662, at least 664 people were accused of witchcraft across Scotland. Probably 300 or more were executed. This wasn't random paranoia. It was systematic persecution. The Scottish Parliament had made witchcraft a capital crime back in 1563, and King James VI, Yes, the same guy who commissioned the King James Bible had written an entire book called Demonology, promoting witch hunts after his personal involvement in the North Berwick trials. Scotland was witch hunt central, so when Isabel Gowdy walked into that church in Aldern and started confessing, she wasn't operating in a vacuum. She knew exactly what happened to accused witches. She'd probably seen women interrogated, imprisoned, maybe even executed. And yet she spoke anyway. Here's what makes Isabel's case so unusual. She was married to a man named John Gilbert, who apparently had nothing to do with any of this. She was illiterate, couldn't read or write, but by all accounts she could talk. The notary who recorded her confessions, a man named John Innes, could barely keep up with her. At several points in the transcripts he literally writes etc., because she's giving him too much information too fast. Can you imagine? She's describing demonic rituals and fairy meetings so enthusiastically that the scribe is like, "Okay, I get it, moving on." Her first confession, on April 13th, begins with her describing how she met the devil at the church in Aldern one night. She says the devil appeared to her and she agreed to renounce her baptism, which was the standard requirement for entering a pact with Satan, according to witch-hunting manuals. The devil then put his mark on her shoulder and sucked blood from it. She names other members of her coven, including women with wonderful Scottish names like Janet Bredhead and Margaret Brodie. Already this is a problem for the authorities, because she's implicating other people, which means more arrests and more trials. But here's where Isabel's confessions get really interesting. 2 weeks later, on May 3rd, she's brought back for a second confession, and this time she's clearly warmed up. She starts providing details that don't appear in any other British witchcraft case. She gives the nicknames of all 13 members of her coven. She describes their familiar spirits, personal demons that served each witch. Hers was called the Red Reaver and dressed in black, which seems counterintuitive but okay. She then proceeds to recite transformation chants. Listen to this. To turn into a hare, she would say, "I shall go into a hare, with sorrow and sigh and mickle care, and I shall go in the devil's name, aye, while I come home again." To turn back into herself, "Hare, hare, God send thee care. I am in a hare's likeness just now, but I shall be in a woman's likeness even now." She gave similar chants for transforming into cats, crows, and other animals. Over the course of all 4 confessions, she provided 27 different magical chants, more than any other British witch trial on record, and they're all in this rhythmic, poetic style that's actually kind of beautiful in a dark way. Now, I need you to pause and think about this for a second. If you were being tortured and forced to confess, would you make up poetry? Would you create an elaborate system of transformation spells with specific wording? Or would you just say whatever the interrogators wanted to hear as quickly as possible to make the pain stop? Isabel's confessions don't sound like someone trying to end suffering. They sound like someone telling a story. She also described what the devil looked like in great detail. Sometimes he appeared as a deer, sometimes as a black man, which in Scottish folklore of the time could mean anything from an actual dark-skinned person to a shadowy figure to someone in dark clothing. She said he was cold to the touch, that his speech was rough and rude, and that he would beat the witches at their meetings. She claimed the coven met regularly at different locations, the Hill of Earlseat, the church at Nairn, and of course, the church at Aldern where it all started. Then Isabel gets into the really wild stuff. She describes elf arrows. These were supposedly deadly projectiles made by the devil and enhanced by small creatures she called elf boys. The devil would give each witch a handful of these arrows, which they'd flick at their enemies using their thumbs. No bow required, just a good thumb flick. If an elf arrow touched someone, even if they were wearing armour, that person would die. Isabel then proceeds to name specific people she claims to have killed with elf arrows, expressing regret for some of them. She mentions a local minister named Harry Forbes, saying they'd cast spells to make him sick. In her third confession on May 15th, she expands on the elf arrow claims and provides more names of people her coven had supposedly killed. She's not holding back at all. In fact, she seems to be accelerating. By the fourth confession on May 27th, the notary notes that there were witnesses present. Word had gotten out about these incredible confessions, and people were showing up to hear what Isabel would say next. She was performing. But here's the part that really sets Isabel apart. She also claimed to have visited the fairy realm. She described meeting the king and queen of the fairies, dining in their fairy hill, and being given food and drink. In Scottish folklore at the time, fairies weren't the tiny winged creatures we think of today. They were powerful, dangerous beings who lived in a parallel world and occasionally interacted with humans. Isabel wove together Christian demonology and Scottish fairy folklore into one coherent narrative. She was essentially telling the authorities, yeah, I'm working with the devil, but also I'm hanging out with the fairies, and by the way, here are all the specific people we've killed. So what was really going on with Isabel Gowdy? Modern scholars have proposed several theories, and honestly none of them are entirely satisfying. Some historians think she might have been experiencing what we'd now recognize as mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia or a dissociative disorder. The vivid detail, the consistency of the delusions, the apparent sincerity, these could all be symptoms of someone experiencing genuine hallucinations or false memories. Other scholars, like Emma Wilby, who literally found Isabel's full confessions in an uncatalogued box at the National Archives of Scotland and wrote a massive study about them, suggest Isabel might have been a shamanistic practitioner. The transformation chants, the spirit journeys, the familiar spirits, these are all common elements in shamanic practices around the world. Maybe Isabel was part of an underground tradition of folk magic that had survived Christianization, and she was describing real practices using the only language available to her, the language of witchcraft and demons that the authorities would understand. There's also the possibility that Isabel was simply an extraordinary storyteller who knew she was doomed. By the time she confessed, the Scottish witch hunt had been raging for a year. She might have been accused by someone else, possibly involved in some kind of community conflict. Once you were accused, the odds of survival were slim. Maybe Isabel decided that if she was going to die anyway, she'd go out with the most memorable confession in Scottish history. And honestly, she succeeded. We're still talking about her. The practical details of her imprisonment are grim. Isabel was held in solitary confinement between her confessions, probably in the Tolbooth, a small prison in Aldern. She was almost certainly subjected to minor tortures that weren't technically considered torture at the time: sleep deprivation, being shaved and searched for the devil's mark, possible pricking by a professional witch pricker named Mr. Patterson, who worked that area of Scotland. Patterson was later exposed as a fraud. Turned out he was actually a woman in disguise who'd been making money by finding witches. But by the time that came out, the damage was done. Based on her confessions, the local authorities applied to the Privy Council in Edinburgh for permission to hold a trial. The confessions were sent to the capital around mid-June 1662. In July, the council granted a commission to try both Isabel and her fellow accused, Janet Bredhead, and then nothing. There's no record of the trial's outcome, no execution record, no release record, nothing. This is actually typical for Scottish witch trials. 90% of them have no recorded outcome because local records have been lost or destroyed. But it drives historians crazy because we desperately want to know what happened to Isabel. Most scholars assume she was found guilty and executed, probably by strangulation and then burning, which was the Scottish method. Some optimistic historians have suggested maybe she was found not guilty due to mental incapacity and released, but given the climate of the time and the content of her confessions, that seems unlikely. Here's what haunts me about Isabel's story. Unlike Alice Keiteler, who was targeted for her wealth and power, or Joan of Arc, who was killed for her military and political authority, Isabel Gowdy had nothing. She was a poor farmer's wife living in a tiny village, completely illiterate, with no social standing whatsoever. She couldn't threaten anyone's power because she had none. So why did she confess? What did she gain? Maybe the answer is simpler than we think. Maybe Isabel Gowdy, living in a world that offered women like her absolutely nothing, no education, no voice, no legacy, found a way to be remembered. In a society where a poor woman's life was worth less than livestock, where she'd be born, work herself to death doing household chores, and die without anyone noting her existence, Isabel created a story so wild, so detailed, so unforgettable that we're still talking about it 360 years later. In 1990, a Scottish composer named James Macmillan wrote an orchestral piece called The Confession of Isabel Gowdy. It's been performed around the world. Isabel has appeared in novels, plays, radio shows. There's academic conferences dedicated to analysing her confessions. She achieved a kind of immortality that almost no other Scottish peasant woman of her era could dream of. The church tried to erase her by not recording her fate. Instead, her own words preserved her. But I want to be clear about something. Romanticising Isabel's story doesn't change the fundamental horror of what happened. Whether she was mentally ill, a storyteller, or a genuine practitioner of folk magic, she was a woman living in a society that gave her exactly two options: silent obscurity or spectacular destruction. And the fact that we're celebrating her confessions, these beautiful, weird, elaborate testimonies, doesn't change the fact that they were almost certainly a death sentence. We're essentially admiring the words of someone who was probably executed for speaking them. The Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1661 to 1662 killed hundreds of people. Most of them didn't leave behind poetry or transformation chants or detailed descriptions of fairy feasts. They left behind nothing but a name in a ledger, if that. Isabel is the exception, not the rule. For every Isabel Gowdy whose words survived, there are dozens of women whose last words were screams that no one recorded. As you're settling in for sleep, think about the power of stories. Isabel Gowdy, whether intentionally or not, understood something fundamental. The stories we tell about ourselves are sometimes the only control we have over our own narrative. In a world trying to erase her, she made herself unforgettable, but at what cost? Now, we've moved from medieval Ireland to Renaissance France to 17th century Scotland. Our next story takes us across the Atlantic to colonial Massachusetts, where an enslaved woman's confession would spark the most famous witch hunt in American history. Her name was Tituba, and unlike Isabel Gowdy, whose confessions seem almost performative, Tituba's confession was extracted through terror and resulted in 19 deaths. Her story shows us what happens when race, slavery, and witch hunts collide, and it's a tragedy that resonates deeply with American history. Let's keep going. Here's something that should make you uncomfortable. Everything you think you know about the Salem witch trials probably centers on white Puritan girls having fits and pointing fingers. But the woman who started it all, the first person accused, the first to confess, the catalyst for 19 executions, was an enslaved woman of colour whose name most people mispronounce and whose story gets conveniently simplified or erased entirely. It's winter, 1692, in Salem Village, Massachusetts. Inside the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, two young girls, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, are exhibiting what today we'd probably call concerning behaviour. They're having fits, screaming, throwing things, contorting their bodies into strange positions and babbling incoherently. The local doctor, William Griggs, examines them, and because this is Puritan Massachusetts and everything is either God or the devil, declares they're under an evil hand. Translation: witchcraft. Now, before these girls started accusing anyone, someone in the household tried a folk remedy. They baked what was called a witch cake, basically a cake made with rye flour and the afflicted girl's urine, and fed it to a dog. The logic was that if witchcraft was involved, the witch would be revealed or the curse would be broken. Who made this witch cake? An enslaved woman named Tituba, who worked in the Parris household. When Reverend Parris found out about the witch cake, he was furious. Not because it was gross, though it was, but because it was devil's magic, a superstitious practice that good Puritans weren't supposed to engage in. And just like that, Tituba became suspect. Let's talk about who Tituba actually was, because here's where American history education fails spectacularly. For decades she was portrayed in textbooks and plays, including Arthur Miller's The Crucible, as either African or simply Barbadian. But more recent scholarship suggests she was likely of indigenous Caribbean heritage, possibly Taino or Arawak, from what's now Venezuela or Barbados. She'd been enslaved and brought to Massachusetts by Samuel Parris when he moved from Barbados to take up the ministry position. So already we're dealing with a woman who's been violently displaced, enslaved, and is living in a deeply racist Puritan community that viewed non-white people as fundamentally suspicious. On February 29th, 1692, yes, a leap day, which some people at the time considered itself unlucky, warrants were issued for the arrest of 3 women: Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church, and Tituba. Notice a pattern. They arrested the most vulnerable, most marginal people in the community, not the wealthy merchants or the pastor's wife, the homeless woman, the sick old woman, and the enslaved woman of colour. The examinations began on March 1st, and they were public spectacles held at the meeting house so everyone could watch. Sarah Good was questioned first and denied everything. Sarah Osborne also denied the charges. But when they brought Tituba before the magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, whose names you should remember because their descendants would later have to live with this shame, something different happened. Tituba confessed. But she didn't just confess. She gave them a confession so detailed, so elaborate, so perfectly aligned with what they wanted to hear, that it probably saved her life while condemning 19 other people to death. She told the magistrates she'd been approached by a tall man from Boston who sometimes appeared with 2 women, later identified in testimony as Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. This tall man had a book, and he wanted her to sign it. She said she'd signed the book, the Devil's Book, though she claimed she didn't know what it meant at the time. She described the man as sometimes appearing with a creature, possibly a dog or a hog, that walked on 2 legs. She said there were other names in the book, and that she'd seen 4 women and a man from Boston whose identity she didn't know. Now, pause here and think about what Tituba was doing. She was giving the magistrates exactly what they wanted. confirmation that there was a witch conspiracy, that multiple people were involved, that the devil was actively recruiting in Massachusetts. She was also strategically deflecting. There are other witches, and they're from Boston, not just Salem. She's spreading the net wider, which creates more investigation and more time. And crucially, she's positioning herself as a cooperating witness rather than a ringleader. The magistrates ate it up. They pressed her for more details. How did she travel to torment the children? She said she rode on a stick with Good and Osborne. What did the devil look like? Sometimes like a man, sometimes like a dog, sometimes like a hog, sometimes like a great black dog. Did she hurt the children? Yes, she admitted to pinching them and afflicting them, but always at the command of the tall man. Here's where it gets psychologically complex. Was Tituba lying to save herself? Almost certainly. Was she also drawing on her own cultural background and folk beliefs that Puritans wouldn't understand or accept? Probably. There's evidence that she'd practiced some forms of divination, like the Venus glass fortune-telling that she'd done with the girls, where you drop egg whites into a glass of water and interpret the shapes. In her Caribbean homeland, these might have been normal folk practices. In Puritan Massachusetts, they were witchcraft. Some historians argue that Tituba's confession was a brilliant act of survival. She told them what they wanted to hear while implicating people who'd already been accused. She created a narrative complex enough to be believable, but vague enough that she couldn't be pinned down on specifics. And critically, she showed remorse and cooperation, which under Puritan logic meant she could be saved. But other scholars, particularly those examining the racial dynamics, point out something darker. Tituba's confession might have been beaten out of her. We know Samuel Parris questioned her before the public examination. We know enslaved people in colonial Massachusetts had zero legal protections and could be punished however their owners saw fit. There's a very real possibility that Parris tortured or threatened Tituba until she agreed to confess, then paraded her in front of the magistrates as proof of his household's victimization. Think about Tituba's impossible position. She's an enslaved woman in a foreign land, surrounded by people who already view her as other and dangerous because of her race. Her owner is a minister obsessed with his reputation, and his household is at the center of a supernatural crisis. If she maintains her innocence, she's calling the minister's daughter and niece liars, which will absolutely get her killed. If she confesses, she might live. It's not really a choice, it's survival calculus, and her confession worked, at least initially. While Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were sent to prison to await trial, and Osborne would die in jail before she could be tried, Tituba's cooperation meant she was seen as a valuable witness. But here's the cruel irony. That same confession that saved her life in March 1692 trapped her in prison for over a year, because while she wasn't executed, she also couldn't be released. She remained in custody, in chains, in a freezing Massachusetts jail cell, surviving on whatever minimal food the jailers provided. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, hell broke loose. Tituba's confession had done exactly what the magistrates hoped. It confirmed that a conspiracy existed. If these three women were witches, who else might be? The afflicted girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon several others who started showing similar symptoms, began naming names. Ann Putnam Jr., a 12-year-old, became one of the most prolific accusers. By April, dozens of people were imprisoned. By June, the first execution took place. By September, 19 people had been hanged. One man had been pressed to death under heavy stones, and at least 5 more had died in custody. Here's a number that should chill you. Of the approximately 200 people accused during the Salem witch trials, what percentage do you think were people of colour or indigenous? Very few, because the population itself was predominantly white Puritan. But that makes Tituba's position even more precarious. She was one of the very few non-white people in Salem village, making her automatically suspicious in a community already primed to see darkness in difference. The trials created a hysteria feedback loop. The more people confessed, the more real the conspiracy seemed. The more real it seemed, the more people were accused. And at the centre of it all was Tituba's initial confession, which had given the magistrates the narrative framework they needed. She described the Devil's Book with multiple signatures. Every subsequent accuser would reference that book. She described spectral travel and tormenting children. Every subsequent confession echoed those details. She'd created the template. But then something shifted. By fall 1693, the hysteria was burning itself out. People were starting to question whether spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions, should be admissible in court. The governor's own wife had been accused, which made the powerful realize they weren't safe either. The trials stopped. Prisoners were gradually released. Tituba remained in jail, not because she was still considered dangerous, but because she was property. Under Massachusetts law at the time, prisoners had to pay for their own incarceration. Food, chains, cell fees, everything. Free people could pay their fees and leave. Enslaved people needed their owners to pay. Samuel Parris refused to pay Tituba's jail fees. Think about that. He'd forced her into this situation, used her confession to validate his household's claims, and then abandoned her to rot in prison because he didn't want to spend the money to free her. Tituba languished in jail for 13 months. Finally, in May 1693, an unknown person purchased her from the prison for the price of her jail fees. We don't know who bought her. We don't know where she went. We don't know if she ever escaped slavery or if she died enslaved. Tituba disappears from the historical record completely after 1693. The church, the colonial authorities, and history itself erased her. This erasure is so complete that when Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible in 1953, a play supposedly about the Salem witch trials but really about McCarthyism, he portrayed Tituba as a willing practitioner of black magic who corrupted innocent white girls. He made her the villain. For decades, that's how American schoolchildren learned about Tituba, as the evil influence who brought witchcraft to Salem. It's only in recent years that scholars have started examining her story through the lens of race, slavery, and survival. Let's talk about what Tituba's story reveals that our previous stories haven't fully addressed: the intersection of race and witch hunts. Alice Keteler was targeted for wealth and power, Joan of Arc for gender and political authority, Isabel Gowdy for reasons we're still debating. But Tituba was targeted for being the easiest scapegoat in a racist society. She was enslaved, she was not white, she had different cultural practices, and she had absolutely no legal standing or protection. And here's the part that connects to modern America. We're still doing this. We're still looking for easy scapegoats when things go wrong. We're still disproportionately targeting people of colour in our justice system. We're still allowing wealthy white people to point fingers at vulnerable populations and watching as the system destroys them while the accusers walk free. The mechanics have changed, but the pattern is identical. Moreover, Tituba's story shows us how confessions work in systems of power. She confessed not because she was guilty, but because confession was her only path to survival. This is exactly what happens in modern false confession cases, which disproportionately affect people of colour. When you're in a position of absolute powerlessness, enslaved, imprisoned, interrogated by people who have total authority over your life, you'll say whatever they want you to say. And then that coerced confession becomes evidence that justifies everything that follows. The 19 people who were executed in Salem, 14 women and 5 men, died because Tituba's forced confession created a narrative that justified mass hysteria. Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, Martha Corey, George Burroughs, John Proctor, all hanged. Giles Corey, pressed to death. And while we remember their names as victims, we need to remember that Tituba was also a victim, perhaps the first victim, whose trauma set everything in motion. There's something uniquely American about the Salem witch trials. European witch hunts were often about religious conformity or competition for resources, but Salem was about community paranoia, racial scapegoating, and the particular cruelty of Puritan ideology that saw sin everywhere and salvation almost nowhere. It was about a society so rigid, so fearful, so convinced of its own righteousness that it could justify hanging children. The youngest victim was 4 years old, imprisoned with her mother, in the name of God. And Tituba, she survived, but at what cost? She spent over a year chained in a freezing cell, was sold like livestock, and then vanished into history without a trace. The church and colonial authorities didn't even bother to erase her. They just stopped recording her existence. That's perhaps the most complete erasure of all, not actively destroyed, but simply discarded and forgotten. Modern scholars, particularly BIPOC historians and descendants of enslaved people, have worked to reclaim Tituba's story. They've pointed out that she was a survivor, not a villain, that her confession was coerced, not voluntary, that she used the only tools available to her, strategic storytelling and cooperation, to stay alive in an impossible situation, and that her disappearance from the record is itself a form of historical violence that we're still working to undo. So as you're lying there in the dark, think about this. How many other Titubas are buried in the footnotes of history? How many women of colour were accused, tortured, executed, or simply erased without anyone bothering to record their names? And how are we still creating systems that sacrifice the most vulnerable among us, while the powerful escape consequences? We've crossed the ocean from Europe to America, seen how witch hunts adapted to colonial racism and slavery. But now we're going back to England, to 1566, to meet the very first woman executed under England's Witchcraft Act. Her name was Agnes Waterhouse, and her story established the template for English witch trials, a template that would kill thousands over the next 2 centuries. She was elderly, poor, and owned a cat. That's all it took. Let's continue. There's a moment in history where everything changes, where a single execution sets a precedent that will echo for centuries. In England, that moment came on July 29th, 1566, when a 63-year-old widow was led to the gallows in Chelmsford, Essex, and hanged by the neck until dead. Her crime: owning a cat named Satan. Agnes Waterhouse wasn't the first person accused of witchcraft in England, not by a long shot. Witch beliefs had existed for centuries, but she was the first woman executed under England's new Witchcraft Act of 1542, later reinforced in 1563, and her trial established a template that would be used to kill thousands of women over the next 150 years. Every element that we associate with English witch trials, the familiar spirit, usually a cat, the elderly, poor woman living alone, the accusation by neighbours, the confession of impossible acts, all of it crystallizes in Agnes's case. She was patient zero for a contagion of illegal murder that would sweep through England like plague. Let's set the stage, because timing matters. When Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church in 1534, he didn't just create a religious schism, he unleashed chaos. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the authority on what was and wasn't heresy, what was sinful, what was demonic. Suddenly, that authority was gone, replaced by a confusing patchwork of Protestant theology that was still figuring itself out. Into that vacuum rushed all kinds of anxieties about religious authority, about social order, about women's roles, about who had power and who didn't. In 1542, during Henry's reign, Parliament passed the first Witchcraft Act, making it a capital crime to use, practice, or exercise any witchcraft, enchantment, charm, or sorcery, whereby any person shall happen to be killed or destroyed. Notice the wording, it had to result in death. Just being a witch wasn't enough. You had to have killed someone with your magic. This law was actually repealed under Edward VI, then reinstated in a stronger form by Elizabeth I in 1563, just 3 years before Agnes's trial. The new act expanded the definition. Now you could be executed for invoking evil spirits, using witchcraft to hurt people even if they didn't die, or even for finding lost goods through magical means. Basically, if your neighbour's cow died and they thought you had something to do with it, you could hang. This law would remain on the books until 1736, 173 years of legal witch hunting. So, in 1566, Agnes Waterhouse is living in Hatfield Peveril, a small village in Essex. She's a widow, which immediately makes her vulnerable. No husband means no male protection or authority in a patriarchal society. She's poor, surviving on the margins, and she has a cat. In later testimony, this cat would be described as white with spots, but at some point it supposedly transformed or was replaced by a toad, because apparently even her familiar couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The accusations against Agnes came from her neighbours, which is important to understand. Unlike Joan of Arc's trial, which was political theatre orchestrated by the English and church authorities, or Alice Keitler's case, driven by wealthy stepchildren wanting inheritance, Agnes's accusation came from the ground up. Regular people turned on her. This is the pattern we'll see repeated throughout English witch trials. Community members accusing other community members, settling grudges, explaining misfortunes, and finding scapegoats for the random cruelties of pre-modern life. Agnes's 18-year-old daughter, Joan Waterhouse, actually testified against her own mother. Let that sink in for a moment. Joan told the court that her mother had a familiar spirit, a demon in animal form that served her, and that this familiar had been fed with drops of Agnes's blood. According to Joan's testimony, Agnes had owned this cat called Satan for 15 or 16 years, keeping it in a basket lined with wool. She supposedly fed it bread, milk, and her own blood, which the cat would suck from her body. Now, before you roll your eyes at the absurdity, understand that familiar spirits were absolutely real in the minds of 16th century English people. They drew on folk beliefs that had existed long before Christianity, blended with medieval Catholic demonology, and filtered through Protestant anxiety about Catholic superstition. The idea was that witches couldn't do magic on their own. They needed a demon to do it for them, and that demon would take the shape of an animal, usually something small and domestic like a cat, dog, toad, or mouse. The neighbours testified to a litany of harm they believed Agnes had caused. William Feeney said that Agnes had bewitched him, causing him to become lame. He claimed that every time Agnes came near him, he felt intense pain. Another neighbour testified that after an argument with Agnes, his livestock started dying mysteriously. A child became sick and blamed Agnes. The pattern is always the same. Something bad happens, someone remembers having a conflict with Agnes, therefore Agnes must have caused it through witchcraft. Here's what's particularly insidious about familiar spirits in English witch trials. They created physical evidence. Witch hunters would search accused women's bodies for witch marks, any unusual mole, birthmark, wart or skin tag, and claim these were teats where the familiar would suckle blood. For elderly women, whose skin naturally develops more marks and irregularities, this was essentially guaranteed evidence. You couldn't win. Having marks proved you were a witch. Not having obvious marks meant you were hiding them through witchcraft, so they'd shave your entire body and search again. Agnes was examined, and they found marks on her body that they declared were witch teats. Never mind that they could have been anything: age spots, moles, hemorrhoids, skin tags. To the examiners, they were proof of demonic contact, and once you had that proof, the confession was almost secondary. But Agnes confessed anyway, though we need to ask ourselves under what conditions. Was she tortured? English law technically didn't allow torture for witch trials, but questioning could involve sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, and conditions so miserable that people would confess to anything for relief. Agnes allegedly confessed to using her cat Satan to kill livestock and make people sick. She admitted to keeping the familiar for years and feeding it with her blood. She said she'd used it to settle scores with neighbours. But here's the detail that should make you pause. Agnes was illiterate and poor. Everything we know about her confession comes from court documents written by educated men. How much of what's recorded is what she actually said, and how much was shaped by the expectations and beliefs of those recording it? There's also the question of whether Agnes had any real grievances that she was expressing through this confession. If you're a poor widow and your neighbours have mistreated you, if the community has failed to support you, if you've been living on the edge of starvation while watching others prosper, maybe there's a grim satisfaction in saying, "Yes, I cursed you, and your cow died." It's not power, but it's the illusion of power, the one thing you're allowed to have before they kill you. The trial itself was held at the Chelmsford Assizes, a travelling court session where serious crimes were judged. These weren't private church proceedings like many European witch trials. These were public, secular courts operating under English common law. That's actually significant. It meant witchcraft was being treated as a criminal offence, like theft or murder, not primarily as a religious offence. The state was executing these women, not the church, which meant the state had a vested interest in maintaining the witch narrative. Agnes Waterhouse was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging, not burning. That's crucial. England hanged its witches, unlike Scotland or continental Europe where burning was common. On July 29th, 1566, she was taken to the gallows in Chelmsford. There's no record of her final words, no dramatic last stand. She was hanged, and her body was likely left on display for a while, as a warning to others, which was standard practice. But her execution was just the beginning. The same trial session that convicted Agnes also tried two other women, her daughter Joan and a woman named Elizabeth Francis. Elizabeth was accused of having originally owned the cat Satan before giving it to Agnes. According to testimony, Elizabeth had kept the familiar for 15 or 16 years, using it to kill people, ruin crops, and cause miscarriages. She allegedly fed it bread, milk, and blood from her finger. Eventually, she gave the cat to Agnes, maybe to get rid of it, maybe as payment for something. Elizabeth was found guilty but not executed. She was imprisoned, only to be tried again later and eventually hanged in 1579. Joan Waterhouse, Agnes's daughter, was tried for using her mother's familiar to bewitch a 12-year-old girl. Joan was found not guilty and released, but think about the psychological damage. She'd testified against her own mother, watched her mother hang, and then barely escaped the same fate herself. What do you do with that? How do you live in the same village after that? The Chelmsford trials of 1566 were widely publicised. Pamphlets were printed and distributed. These were basically the viral media of their day, describing the trials in sensational detail. People all over England could read about Agnes Waterhouse and her cat Satan, about Elizabeth Francis feeding blood to her demon, about the terrible harm these witches had caused. These pamphlets established the English witch narrative. Poor old women with familiar spirits, using their demons to harm neighbours' livestock and children, suckling them with blood from marks on their bodies. This narrative was incredibly powerful because it was domestic and personal. Unlike continental European witch trials, which often involved elaborate conspiracies, Sabbaths, and flying to meet the devil, English witch trials were about neighbourhood disputes and everyday misfortunes. Your neighbour's cow died? Witchcraft. Your child got sick? Witchcraft. Your butter wouldn't churn? Witchcraft. It made witchcraft feel immediate and threatening, like it could be happening right next door. And the familiar spirit concept. That was particularly English. While continental European witch hunters obsessed over the witch's Sabbath and demonic pacts sealed with sex, English witch hunters focused on these small demons that looked like household pets. It's almost mundane in its horror, the idea that your neighbour's cat might actually be a demon plotting your death. It turned every stray animal into potential evidence of witchcraft. Over the next 150 years, thousands of people, mostly women, mostly poor and elderly, would be tried and executed for witchcraft in England. The peak came during the English Civil War in the 1640s, when a man named Matthew Hopkins declared himself the Witchfinder General and went on a killing spree across East Anglia, executing at least 100 people in 2 years. Every single one of those trials echoed Agnes Waterhouse's. Accusations by neighbours, searches for witch marks, confessions extracted under pressure, familiar spirits described in detail. Here's what Agnes's story teaches us that our previous stories haven't fully captured: the creation of a legal precedent and social panic. Alice Keitler's case was about individual persecution of a powerful woman. Joan of Arc's trial was political theatre. Isabel Gaudi's confession was a personal mystery. Tituba's story was about racial scapegoating. But Agnes Waterhouse, her execution created a system. It established that ordinary people could accuse their neighbours of witchcraft, and the state would validate those accusations with execution. It turned witch hunting into a community activity. This is what makes English witch trials particularly insidious. They were participatory. You didn't need a zealous bishop or a paranoid king. You just needed neighbours who were willing to blame each other for their problems, and a legal system willing to accept spectral evidence and witch marks as proof. It was bottom-up oppression, where communities policed themselves and punished deviation, poverty, and old age with death. And who were the victims? Overwhelmingly, elderly women. Why? Because in a society without social safety nets, elderly women who'd outlived their husbands and couldn't work were seen as burdens. They had to rely on community charity, which bred resentment. They often had sharp tongues, because if you've survived 60-plus years in a harsh world, you're not going to be meek and mild. They were visible and vulnerable, and conveniently, their bodies bore the marks of age that could be interpreted as witch marks. There's something particularly cruel about this. We're talking about women who'd worked their entire lives, raised children, contributed to their communities, and then in their final years, when they most needed support, they were accused of being in league with Satan and hanged. Agnes Waterhouse was 63. She'd survived plague, famine, religious upheaval, and the general brutality of Tudor England, only to be killed by her own neighbours over a cat. The Church tried to erase these women by justifying their executions as necessary for community safety. But actually, they weren't trying that hard to erase them. They publicised these trials. The erasure came later, as English society became embarrassed by its witch-hunting past. By the 18th century, educated people were portraying witch trials as medieval superstition, conveniently forgetting that most English witch executions happened in the 16th and 17th centuries, firmly in the early modern period. They wanted to pretend it was ancient history when it was actually relatively recent. Today, when we think of witch trials, we often think of Salem, which happened over a century after Agnes Waterhouse. But Salem was an outlier, a brief, intense hysteria that burned itself out. England's witch hunting was sustained, systematic, and deadly over centuries, and it all started with a widow and her cat. Think about this as you're settling in. How many community scapegoats exist today? Who are the people we collectively decide are problems to be eliminated rather than individuals to be supported? Elderly people who are seen as burdens on healthcare systems. Homeless people we'd rather not see. Immigrants blamed for economic problems. The mechanisms change, but the pattern, find someone vulnerable, blame them for your troubles, punish them with community approval, that pattern persists. Agnes Waterhouse set a precedent, but not the one the authorities intended. They thought they were creating a deterrent. Instead, they created a blueprint for how communities tear themselves apart. And the scapegoats are always the same: the poor, the old, the different, the defenceless. We've now traced witch hunts from Ireland to France to Scotland to America to England, spanning from 1324 to 1566. But we're about to jump forward over 200 years to 1782 to meet the last woman legally executed for witchcraft in all of Europe. Her name was Anna Goldie, and her story is perhaps the most shocking of all, because it happened during the Age of Enlightenment, when educated people were supposed to know better. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Let's keep going. Imagine you're a historian in 1782 documenting the progress of human civilization. The American Revolution has just succeeded. The French Revolution is 7 years away. Voltaire and Rousseau have been writing about reason and human rights. The Enlightenment is in full swing. Science is triumphing over superstition, reason over fear, progress over medieval darkness. And then you hear that in Switzerland, one of the most educated countries in Europe, they've just beheaded a woman for witchcraft. Wait, what? On June 13th, 1782, in the small Swiss canton of Glarus, a 48-year-old maidservant named Anna Goldie was led to the execution ground. The executioner raised his sword and brought it down on her neck, severing her head from her body. The official charge was poisoning, but everyone knew what it really was. They'd tortured her until she confessed to making a pact with the devil, who'd appeared to her as a large black dog and given her needles to put in her employer's daughter's milk. This was a witch trial in everything but name, and it happened just 7 years before the French Revolution would proclaim the rights of man. Anna Goldie's execution sparked outrage across Europe and the Holy Roman Empire. Newspapers condemned it as barbaric. Educated people were appalled. Even the officials involved seemed ashamed. They deliberately avoided using the word witchcraft in the formal charges, and they destroyed the court protocols afterward to hide the evidence. But the damage was done. Switzerland had just demonstrated that the Enlightenment was a thin veneer covering the same old brutality, and that when powerful men wanted to destroy a woman, they'd use whatever tools were available, even ones that were supposedly obsolete. Let's go back to the beginning of Anna's story, because it's important to understand that she wasn't some random victim. She was specifically, deliberately targeted by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Anna was born on October 24th, 1734 in Senwald, a village in eastern Switzerland. She was the fourth of 8 children in a very poor family. At 18, she started working as a domestic servant, basically her only option for survival. Between 1762 and 1765, she worked at the rectory in Senveld. Then, when she was 31, she got pregnant. The father was a travelling mercenary who left Switzerland before the baby was born, which was conveniently typical for the time. Here's where Anna's life takes its first tragic turn. The baby died the night it was born. Infant mortality was extremely high in the 18th century. Maybe 20 to 30% of babies didn't survive their first year. But that didn't matter. Anna was accused of infanticide, murdering her own child. We have no way of knowing what really happened. The baby could have suffocated accidentally in its sleep, could have had any number of medical problems. But a poor unmarried woman with a dead baby. Guilty. She was pilloried, publicly humiliated in the town square, and sentenced to 6 years of house arrest. After serving her sentence, Anna moved to the canton of Glarus and found work with a family named Zwicky in Malice, where she worked from 1768 until 1775 or 1776. Then she moved again and found employment with the Tschudi family. And this is where everything goes catastrophically wrong, because Johann Jakob Tschudi was not a good man. Tschudi was a physician, a magistrate, and a rising political figure. Basically, he was as powerful as you could get in a small Swiss canton. He came from one of the richest families in Glarus. He was educated, enlightened, presumably had read all the great philosophers about reason and justice, and according to historical evidence and later analysis, he almost certainly had a sexual affair with his maidservant Anna. Now, before you think affair implies consent or equality, let's be clear about the power dynamics here. Anna was employed by Tschudi. She lived in his house. She was economically dependent on him. He had total authority over her employment, her reputation, and her future. In that context, there's no such thing as a consensual affair. There's only exploitation. This is the 18th century equivalent of a CEO sleeping with a subordinate, except with even less legal protection for the victim. Anna worked for the Tschudi family for 17 years, without any problems. Then, in 1781, something changed. Tschudi suddenly reported to local authorities that he'd found needles in his 8-year-old daughter's bread and milk. He claimed Anna had put them there through supernatural means. The child had supposedly been having seizures and vomiting pins and other metal objects. Let's pause here and ask the obvious question. Does this sound familiar? Children vomiting pins and nails is a recurring motif in witch trials. We saw it in the Salem trials, where afflicted girls claim to be tormented by spectres. It appears in English trials. It's almost like a script that people followed when they wanted to accuse someone of witchcraft. And in 1781, in enlightened Switzerland, Johann Jakob Tschudi was following that script. Modern historians analysing the case have reached a pretty clear conclusion about what was really happening. Tschudi wanted to get rid of Anna. Maybe she was threatening to expose their affair. Maybe he was afraid his wife or the community would find out. Maybe Anna was pregnant again, or demanding something, or simply becoming inconvenient. Whatever the reason, he needed her gone in a way that would destroy her credibility completely. And in 1781, Switzerland, even though educated people no longer believed in witches, the accusation still worked because it tapped into something primal: fear and prejudice. Anna was fired and strongly encouraged to leave town. She did, managing to escape initially, but the authorities of Glarus weren't going to let her go that easily. On February 9th, 1782, they advertised a reward for her capture in the Zürcher Zeitung, one of Switzerland's newspapers. Think about that. They took out a newspaper ad offering a bounty for a middle-aged maidservant who'd supposedly bewitched a child. It's like putting out an APB for someone accused of using magic. The absurdity of it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. Anna was arrested and brought back to Glarus, and then the torture began. Now, by 1782, most European countries had officially abolished torture, or at least severely limited its use. Switzerland was supposed to be one of the more progressive regions, but for Anna they brought back methods that hadn't been used in decades. They hung her by her thumbs with stones tied to her feet, a technique called strappado that causes excruciating pain and can dislocate shoulders. They kept her in solitary confinement. They interrogated her relentlessly. Under this torture, Anna confessed. She said she had entered into a pact with the devil, who had appeared to her as a large black dog. He'd given her needles to put in the child's food. She admitted to everything they wanted her to admit. It's the same pattern we've seen before. Torture breaks people, and they'll confess to literally anything to make it stop. The difference is that in 1782, everyone involved should have known better. When the torture ended, Anna withdrew her confession. This is crucial. She said it wasn't true, that she'd only confessed because of the pain. But then they tortured her again, and she confessed again. At a certain point, you learn that telling them what they want to hear is the only way to survive even a little bit longer. Here's the really damning part. The authorities knew they couldn't officially try her for witchcraft. By 1782, that would have been too embarrassing, so they charged her with poisoning instead, even though Swiss law at the time did not impose the death penalty for non-lethal poisoning. The child hadn't died. The needles hadn't actually poisoned anyone in the medical sense, but they sentenced Anna to death anyway. Throughout the trial, official allegations of witchcraft were avoided. The court protocols, the formal records of the proceedings, were destroyed afterward. They were trying to have it both ways, execute her as a witch, but hide the evidence that they'd conducted a witch trial. It's institutional cowardice and corruption at its most transparent. On June 13th, 1782, Anna was taken to the execution ground in Glarus. Unlike the burnings we've discussed in previous stories, Switzerland used beheading for this type of execution. The executioner's sword came down, and Anna Göldi became the last person legally executed for witchcraft in Europe. She was 48 years old, the same age as many of us listening to this right now. The news of her execution spread quickly, and the reaction was immediate and furious. This wasn't the 16th century when witch executions were common. This was 1782. Newspapers across Switzerland and Germany condemned it. Intellectuals were appalled. People recognized it for what it was: a miscarriage of justice, a powerful man destroying a vulnerable woman using medieval superstition as a weapon. For the first time in history, people started using the term judicial murder to describe a witch execution. That's significant. It meant that even contemporaries recognized that this wasn't legitimate justice. It was murder dressed up in legal clothing. The execution marked a turning point. After Anna Goldie, no more legal witch executions would occur in Europe, not because the law suddenly changed, but because the public wouldn't tolerate it anymore. But here's the question that should keep you up at night. Why did it take until 1782? Why did it require the execution of one more woman after tens of thousands had already died, before European society collectively said, enough? And why did it take another 226 years before anyone bothered to officially exonerate her? That's right, 226 years. In 2007, on the 225th anniversary of her execution, the Swiss Parliament acknowledged Anna Goldie's case as a miscarriage of justice and called for her exoneration. On August 27, 2008, she was officially exonerated on the grounds that she'd been subjected to an illegal trial. Better late than never, I suppose, except Anna was still dead. In 2017, a museum was opened in Glarus dedicated to Anna's life and the history of witch trials. There's a memorial at the Glarus courthouse consisting of 2 permanently lit lamps, representing violations of human rights worldwide, and serving as a reminder of the injustice done to Anna. Her story has been told in novels, films, musicals, and podcasts, but none of that brings her back or undoes the torture and terror of her final months. What makes Anna's story different from our previous cases? It's the stark contrast between society's supposed enlightenment and its actual behaviour. Alice Kittler was tried in 1324, when belief in witchcraft was universal. Joan of Arc in 1431, same era. Isabel Godey in 1662, when witch trials were at their peak. Tituba and Agnes in a period when these beliefs were still culturally dominant. But Anna? Anna was executed when Immanuel Kant was writing philosophy, when Mozart was composing symphonies, when Benjamin Franklin was conducting electricity experiments. The world had moved on, except it hadn't. This is what Anna's story reveals. Progress is not linear, and enlightenment is not universal. You can have a society that's scientifically advanced, culturally sophisticated, and politically progressive on paper, and still have that society murder a woman through judicial torture because a powerful man wanted her silenced. The tools of oppression adapt to whatever intellectual framework is available. In 1324 they used Catholic theology. In 1782 they used legal technicalities and destroyed evidence. Moreover, Anna's case exposes something we haven't fully addressed in previous stories: the intersection of sexual exploitation and witch accusations. We've talked about wealth, power, gender, race, age, and community scapegoating. But Anna's story is fundamentally about a man who sexually exploited an employee and then destroyed her when she became inconvenient. This pattern, powerful man has affair with subordinate, needs to silence her, uses whatever accusation will stick, is not remotely obsolete. We see it constantly. Think about modern parallels. How many women have been destroyed professionally, legally or socially because they threaten to expose powerful men's misconduct? How many times have we seen victims blamed, discredited or punished while perpetrators walk free? The Me Too movement exposed thousands of cases, but for every case that became public, how many women were silenced through settlements, NDAs, reputation destruction, or worse? Anna Goldie didn't have Me Too. She didn't have newspapers that would believe her story, or lawyers who would defend her, or laws that protected servants from employer abuse. She had a powerful man who wanted her gone, a legal system willing to facilitate her destruction, and a community that watched it happen. Even the people who were horrified only spoke up after she was already dead. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Anna's execution only became a scandal because it was late in history. If Johann Jakob Tschudi had done the exact same thing 50 years earlier, no one would have blinked. The horror isn't just what happened to Anna, it's how many other Annas were destroyed in similar ways when it wasn't yet shocking. How many maidservants were sexually exploited by their employers and then discarded, accused, imprisoned, or executed, and nobody cared because it was normal? The Enlightenment promised that reason would free us from superstition and barbarism. Anna Göldy's execution proved that educated, reasonable men could be just as barbaric as their medieval predecessors. They just wrote better documentation beforehand and destroyed it afterward. The veneer of civilization is exactly that, a veneer. Scratch it, and the same cruelty emerges. As you're lying there processing these stories, think about how we measure progress. We look at technology, art, philosophy, science, all advancing. But how do we measure moral progress? If a society can torture and execute an innocent woman in 1782 using methods barely different from 1324, has that society actually progressed? Or has it just gotten better at justifying its cruelty? Anna Göldy's story is the last legal witch execution in Europe, but it's not the end of witch hunting. Even today, in 2025, there are regions of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, Papua New Guinea, and parts of India, where people are still accused of witchcraft and killed, often brutally. The mechanisms persist even when the official legal framework changes. The desire to blame, scapegoat, and destroy the vulnerable doesn't disappear just because we call ourselves enlightened. We're now at the halfway point in our journey through history's erased witches. We've seen executions, escapes, confessions, and catastrophic injustice spanning 500 years and multiple continents. But up next, we're heading to Sweden for a story that might be the most heartbreaking yet. A mother accused of witchcraft by her own daughters. Malin Matsdotter's case shows us what happens when family bonds are weaponized by witch hunters, when children become informants against their parents, and when even maternal love can't protect you from a system designed to destroy. Stay with me. Her story is one you need to hear. There are betrayals that come from enemies, and then there are betrayals that come from the people who are supposed to love you most. The worst accusation you can face isn't from a stranger or a rival. It's when your own children look you in the eye and tell authorities you're a monster. July 1676, Stockholm, Sweden. A widowed woman stands before a tribunal, listening as her own daughters testify against her. They claim their mother abducted their children, her grandchildren, and took them to satanic sabbaths in the middle of the night. They describe in vivid detail how she forced these innocent children to worship the devil, to dance with demons, to participate in unholy rituals. The woman denies everything, pleading with her daughters to tell the truth. But her pleas fall on deaf ears. The court finds her guilty based primarily on her daughter's testimony and the fact that she can't recite certain prayers correctly. Her name is Malin Matsdotter, and she's about to become one of the last people executed for witchcraft in Stockholm, killed not by strangers or authorities, but by her own family. How does this happen? How do children become weapons against their parents? And what does Malin's story teach us about the psychology of witch hunts that none of our previous stories have fully revealed? Because what we're about to uncover isn't just about one woman's tragedy. It's about how fear can poison family bonds so thoroughly that children will sacrifice their parents to save themselves. Let's set the stage, because context is everything. Sweden in 1676 was experiencing what historians call the Great Noise, det stora oväsendet in Swedish. This wasn't a scattered witch hunt here and there. This was mass hysteria on a scale that Sweden had never seen before or since. Between 1668 and 1676, Sweden conducted its largest witch trials ever, centred primarily in the province of Dalarna, but spreading like wildfire to other regions, including Stockholm. Here's what made the Swedish witch trials particularly horrifying. They focused obsessively on children. Not children as victims in the way Salem did, where girls claimed to be bewitched. No, in Sweden, the panic was about witches stealing children and taking them to a place called Blokulla, literally Blue Hill, where the devil held his Sabbath. According to the accusations, witches would sneak into homes at night, abduct sleeping children, and force them to participate in demonic worship. The children would then return home with no memory of what happened, or worse, they'd be so traumatized that they'd start exhibiting strange behaviors. This created a nightmare scenario. Children began accusing adults en masse. But here's the twisted part. The children weren't just accusing random adults. They were accusing their own parents, their teachers, their neighbors, people they knew intimately. And the courts believed them. Swedish authorities took children's testimony as the most reliable evidence because children were seen as innocent, incapable of lying about something so serious. If a child said their mother took them to Blokulla, it must be true. Can you see what's happening here? The witch hunters had created a system where children held absolute power over adults, and once that precedent was established, it spread like a contagion. Children learned that accusing someone of witchcraft brought attention, importance, and protection. They learned that adults would hang on their every word. Some were probably coached by authority figures who wanted specific people accused. Others might have been caught up in mass hysteria, genuinely believing false memories that interrogators had planted. Still others might have been settling scores or seeking attention in a society that normally ignored children completely. Into this toxic environment came Malin Matsdotter. She was a widow. We don't know exactly when her husband died or under what circumstances, but by 1676 she was living alone, which automatically made her vulnerable. She had adult daughters who had their own children, and in July 1676, during the height of the Great Noise, those daughters turned on her. The accusations were specific and damning. Malin's daughters claimed she'd been coming to their homes at night and taking their children, Malin's own grandchildren, to Blokulla. They described how she'd forced the children onto supernatural animals or broomsticks and fly them through the darkness to the Devil's Mountain. There, according to the testimony, Malin would make the children renounce their baptisms, worship Satan, and participate in obscene rituals. The children supposedly came home exhausted and disturbed, unable to explain where they'd been. Now let's think about this rationally for a moment. Malin was a widow, probably in her 50s or 60s, based on the fact that she had adult daughters with their own children. She's supposedly sneaking around Stockholm at night, breaking into her daughters' homes, kidnapping multiple children, flying them to a magical mountain, conducting satanic rituals, and then returning them before morning, all without anyone noticing except the children themselves, who conveniently can't remember details but know it was definitely their grandmother. Does this sound plausible? To us, no. To a Swedish court in 1676? Absolutely. The trial records show that Malin denied the charges. She insisted she'd never harmed her grandchildren, never participated in witchcraft, never been to Blokulla. But her denials meant nothing against her daughter's accusations. In the logic of the witch trials, denial was almost seen as further evidence of guilt. Of course, a witch would deny being a witch. Then the court examined her religious knowledge, which was standard procedure in Swedish witch trials. They asked her to recite prayers, to demonstrate her knowledge of Christian doctrine. Malin, like many women of her era, was probably illiterate or barely educated. She'd learned prayers by rote memorization, maybe imperfectly. She couldn't recite them perfectly on demand, especially not while standing trial for her life, watching her own daughters testify against her. Her inability to perform religious literacy tests was taken as evidence that she'd abandoned Christianity in favor of devil worship. Think about the psychological torture of this situation. Imagine being a mother who raised these daughters, who helped them through childhood illnesses and marriages and childbirth, who loved their children as her own grandchildren. And now those same daughters are standing in a courtroom describing how you're a demon worshipper who's been terrorizing their children. How do you process that? How do you defend yourself when the accusers are people you love? There's a theory about what really happened, though we'll never know for certain. Some historians suggest that Malin's daughters might have been under pressure from the community or authorities. During the Great Noise, there was enormous pressure to identify witches. If your children showed any signs of distress or unusual behavior, you had to explain it. Saying, "My mother is a witch who's been abducting them," deflected suspicion away from yourself and your household. It's possible, likely, even, that Malin's daughters accused her to protect themselves and their children from being accused. This is the insidious genius of witch hunts. They turn communities against themselves. They make people choose between loyalty and survival almost always wins, even if it means sacrificing family. There's also the question of genuine belief. Did Malin's daughters actually believe she was a witch? After months or years of hearing about Blåkulla, of children all over Sweden describing similar experiences, of authorities confirming that witches were stealing children, did they genuinely come to believe their mother was involved? Mass hysteria can make people believe impossible things. When an entire society is telling you that witches are real, and they're everywhere, and your children are having nightmares or acting strangely, it's psychologically easier to accept the witch explanation than to confront more mundane possibilities like childhood anxiety, illness, or simple bad dreams. Or maybe, and this is darker, there were existing family tensions that we'll never know about. Maybe Malin had been critical of how her daughters were raising their children. Maybe there were inheritance disputes. Maybe she'd said something that offended them. Witch accusations were remarkably effective tools for settling personal grudges, and family grudges could be especially bitter. Whatever the motivation, the result was the same. Malin Matsdotter was found guilty of witchcraft based largely on her daughter's testimony and her imperfect recitation of prayers. She was sentenced to death. On the day of execution, Malin was taken to the execution ground, along with another woman named Anna Simonsdotter Hack, who'd been caught up in the same witch hunt. The two women became the last people executed for witchcraft in Stockholm. The method was burning, but in a small mercy, if you can call it that, they were strangled first so they'd be dead before the flames consumed their bodies. It was considered merciful to kill them quickly rather than burn them alive. Can you imagine Malin's final moments? Did she look for her daughters in the crowd? Did she hope they'd recant at the last second, admit they'd been wrong, beg for forgiveness? Or had she already given up on them, resigned to dying, betrayed by the people she'd brought into the world? The Great Noise eventually burned itself out, as these panics always do. By 1677, Swedish authorities were starting to question whether all these children's testimonies could really be true. The Royal Commission investigating the trials found inconsistencies and evidence of coaching. Many of the accused were eventually released, but for Malin and Anna and the dozens of others who'd already been executed, that realization came too late. Here's what makes Marlin's story uniquely horrifying compared to our previous cases: the intimacy of the betrayal. Alice Keteler was betrayed by stepchildren who wanted her money. There was a clear financial motive. But Malin, she was betrayed by her biological daughters, the children she'd raised from birth. There's no inheritance motive here, no obvious gain, just fear, pressure, and the toxic dynamics of a witch hunt that incentivized turning on your own family. This reveals something about witch hunts that we haven't fully explored yet. They're most effective when they weaponize existing relationships. Neighbors accusing neighbors is bad enough, but when the system makes it profitable or necessary to accuse family members, it creates a level of social destruction that's almost impossible to repair. After the Great Noise ended, Swedish communities were shattered. How do you maintain family bonds when brother testified against sister, daughter against mother, husband against wife? The fabric of trust was simply gone. Moreover, Malin's story shows us the particular danger of using children as witnesses in witch trials. Children are suggestible, they're easily coached. They can't always distinguish between reality and imagination, especially when adults in authority are telling them that their dreams or fears are real memories of supernatural events. When you give children's testimony absolute credibility in a system that's already disposed to believe in witchcraft, you create a recipe for catastrophic injustice. This isn't just historical critique, it's directly relevant today. We've seen cases where children's testimony, particularly in abuse cases, has been contaminated by suggestive interviewing techniques. We've seen how moral panics, like the satanic ritual abuse panic of the 1980s, can lead to false accusations based on coerced or fabricated children's testimony. The mechanisms that destroyed Marlin Matsdotter are still operational. We've just dressed them in modern psychological terminology. There's also something to be said about the specific vulnerability of widows in witch trials. We've seen this pattern repeatedly. Alice Keiteler was a widow. Agnes Waterhouse was a widow. Anna Goldie was unmarried and vulnerable, and now Malin was a widow. Women without husbands had no male protector, no built-in defender in a patriarchal legal system. They were economically vulnerable, socially marginal, and if they were elderly, they were seen as burdens rather than contributors. But Marlin's case adds another layer. Even having family, having daughters and grandchildren, didn't protect her. In fact, her family became the weapon used against her. This suggests that in the world of witch hunts, no relationship was safe, no bond was sacred. The system could corrupt and weaponize anything. Think about the long-term trauma this created. Malin's daughters had to live with what they'd done. After the panic ended, after Swedish society acknowledged that the Great Noise had been a catastrophic miscarriage of justice, how did those daughters face themselves? Did they believe they'd done the right thing? Did they feel guilt? Did they tell their children, the supposed victims, what had really happened? Or did everyone just collectively agree never to speak of it again, letting the trauma fester in silence? And what about the children? Malin's grandchildren? They grew up knowing that testimony they'd given, whether true, false, coerced, or imagined, had led to their grandmother's execution. How do you process that as a child? How does that shape your understanding of truth, family, and justice? The Church tried to erase these stories not by destroying records but by moving on quickly and never speaking of them again. After the Great Noise, Swedish society basically pretended it hadn't happened. There was no reckoning, no apology to the families destroyed, no acknowledgement that the system had been catastrophically wrong. They just stopped doing witch trials and hoped everyone would forget. But we can't forget. Malin Matsdotter's story matters because it shows us that witch hunts don't just kill individuals, they poison communities, destroy families, and create trauma that echoes through generations. When you create a system where accusing someone brings safety and refusing to accuse brings danger, you incentivize betrayal. And once betrayal becomes normalized, once children learn to testify against parents and siblings against each other, you've created a society that's fundamentally broken at the level of human relationships. As you're processing this story, think about how trust works in your own life. How fragile are the bonds that hold families and communities together? What would it take to break those bonds? And how quickly could fear transform love into betrayal? These aren't just historical questions, they're present tense, because the psychological mechanisms haven't changed. We've now seen witch hunts destroy women through wealth confiscation, political machination, racial scapegoating, systemic legal precedent, sexual exploitation, and family betrayal. But our next story takes us into even darker territory: royal paranoia. When a king becomes convinced that witches are trying to kill him, when the most powerful man in the country targets a respected healer and midwife, the body count rises exponentially. Agnes Sampson's story shows us what happens when witch hunting becomes state policy driven by one man's fear. Let's keep going, because her torture was so extensive, her interrogation so brutal, that even hardened historians find the records difficult to read. When paranoia meets absolute power, the death toll is never small. We've seen witch hunts driven by greed, gender, race, community fear, and family betrayal. But what happens when the person driving the witch hunt is a king, someone with unlimited resources, legal authority, and a personal conviction that witches are trying to murder him? What happens when one man's fear becomes national policy? The year is 1590. And King James VI of Scotland is sailing home from Denmark with his new bride, Anne of Denmark. They've just gotten married, and James is eager to bring his queen back to Scotland. But the North Sea has other plans. Violent storms batter their ships, nearly sinking them multiple times. The journey that should have taken days stretches into weeks of terror. Sailors drown, ships are damaged. The royal couple barely makes it back alive, and James, instead of thinking, "Wow, the North Sea is dangerous," in October, decides witches are trying to kill me. This isn't just paranoia, James is absolutely convinced. And when you're the king, your personal delusions become state policy. What follows is the North Berwick witch trials, one of the most brutal witch hunts in Scottish history. Over 70 people will be accused, dozens will be tortured, many will die. And at the centre of it all is a woman named Agnes Sampson, a respected midwife and healer from East Lothian, who will be tortured so extensively that the king himself will personally supervise her interrogation at Holyrood Palace. Her story shows us what happens when witch hunting is weaponized by the state's highest authority, and why the systematic elimination of female healers was never really about magic at all. Let's talk about who Agnes Sampson was before she became the wise wife of Keith. That's what people called her, a wise woman, a healer. She wasn't some marginal figure. Agnes was a respected member of her community in North Berwick, a small town on the Scottish coast. She was a midwife, which in the 16th century was an absolutely crucial role. Without hospitals or modern medicine, midwives were the ones who caught babies, who treated childhood illnesses, who knew herbal remedies and traditional healing practices. They were the medical professionals of their communities. Agnes was also what we'd call a cunning woman, someone who knew charms, folk remedies, herbal medicine. She could treat ailments, predict outcomes, maybe do a bit of fortune-telling. This wasn't considered evil or even particularly unusual. Every village had someone like this. They were part of the social fabric, filling a medical need that the formal, male, medical establishment wasn't addressing. But here's the catch. That knowledge made them simultaneously essential and threatening. In October 1590, when those storms hit James's fleet, someone needed to be blamed. Random weather wasn't an acceptable explanation when you had a king who'd been reading continental European witch-hunting manuals and was already predisposed to believe in demonic conspiracies. James had actually spent time in Denmark, where witch trials were common, and he'd brought back both a wife and a newly intensified belief in witchcraft. The initial accusations came from a young servant girl named Giles Duncan, who worked for a local magistrate. Her employer, David Seaton, noticed she was sneaking out at night and decided she must be doing something nefarious. He tortured her, and yes, I mean literally tortured her, even though she was just a teenager working in his house. He used devices called pillywinks, which were thumbscrews that crushed fingers, and the witch's bridle, a metal contraption that went in the mouth with spikes that would tear the tongue if you moved it. After enduring this, Giles confessed to being a witch and started naming other people in her supposed coven. Agnes Sampson's name came up. Giles claimed that Agnes was one of the leaders of a coven of 200 witches, 200, who'd gathered at North Berwick Church on Halloween to plot against King James. According to Giles's confession, they'd performed elaborate rituals to raise storms to sink the king's ship. They'd christened a cat and thrown it into the sea to cause tempests. They'd made wax images of the king to melt in order to make him waste away. This was a full-scale demonic conspiracy to commit regicide through witchcraft. Now, does any of this sound remotely plausible? Could 200 people gather in a church without anyone noticing? Could throwing a cat into the ocean create specific storms at specific times? Could melting a wax figure kill a person? To us, obviously not. But to King James VI, who was obsessed with his own mortality and convinced of his divine right to rule, this was terrifyingly real. If witches were trying to kill him, that was treason. And treason demanded the harshest possible response. Agnes was arrested and brought in for questioning. At first, she denied everything. She was probably in her 50s or 60s, a respected woman who'd spent decades serving her community. She had no reason to confess to something she hadn't done. But denial was not an option the authorities were willing to accept. The torture began. And I need to warn you, what I'm about to describe is genuinely disturbing. Agnes Sampson was subjected to what might be the most extensively documented torture of any witch trial victim. They started with sleep deprivation, keeping her awake for days until her mind couldn't function properly. Then they shaved her entire body, searching for the devil's mark. Every mole, freckle, birthmark, or skin irregularity was examined and pricked with pins to see if it would bleed or cause pain. The logic was that marks where the devil had touched you wouldn't feel pain or bleed normally. Of course, this is nonsense. Some skin lesions have less sensation due to nerve damage, but that's biology, not Satan. When she still wouldn't confess, they escalated. They used the pillywinks on her fingers, crushing them between metal screws. They attached what was called a witch's bridle, or scold's bridle, a metal cage that went over the head with a spiked plate that pressed down on the tongue. Any movement of the mouth or tongue would cause the spikes to tear the flesh. Imagine trying to speak, to plead for mercy, and every word causing sharp metal to stab into your tongue. They used rope torture, binding her head with rope and twisting it tighter and tighter with a stick, creating pressure that felt like your skull was being crushed. This technique, called thrawing, could cause permanent brain damage. They chained her to the wall in uncomfortable positions for hours or days. They may have used the boots, a device that crushed the legs and feet between boards, shattering bones. All of this was documented. They kept records. They noted that Agnes was difficult and resilient, which is a horrifying way of saying she was trying desperately not to confess to something she hadn't done. But eventually, after days or weeks of this torture, Agnes broke. Everyone breaks eventually. The human body and mind can only endure so much. She confessed. She admitted to being part of a coven that had tried to kill the king. She described the meeting at North Berwick Church in elaborate detail. Who was there, what they did, what the devil looked like. She confirmed the stories about the cat and the wax figure and the storms. She gave them everything they wanted to hear. But here's where King James's personal involvement becomes truly grotesque. James didn't just order Agnes's torture from a distance. He personally supervised part of her interrogation. He went to Holyrood Palace, where Agnes was being held, to question her himself. This was unprecedented. Kings didn't normally involve themselves directly in the interrogation of commoners, but James was obsessed. During this interrogation, there's a famous incident. Agnes, trying to prove that she really was a witch and had special knowledge, supposedly told James something in private, whispered in his ear the exact words he'd said to his wife Anne on their wedding night. James was reportedly astonished and declared that she couldn't possibly have known this except through witchcraft. Let's think about this for a second. What actually happened here? There are a few possibilities. 1. Agnes, after extensive torture, was desperate to say anything that would make it stop, so she made something up or remembered some rumour she'd heard, and James, being suggestible and already convinced she was a witch, interpreted it as accurate. 2. James himself was creating this story to justify the trials and his personal involvement. 3. Someone in the royal household had gossiped, and Agnes happened to overhear it at some point and was clever enough to use it to save herself, at least temporarily. But the official narrative, that witchcraft gave her supernatural knowledge, became part of the legal record and was used to justify everything that followed. Agnes was found guilty of witchcraft and treason. Her execution was particularly brutal, even by the standards of the time. She was taken to Edinburgh Castle and burned at the stake. But unlike some burnings where victims were strangled first as a mercy, Agnes was likely burned alive. The records suggest they wanted her death to be a spectacle, a warning to anyone else who might consider using witchcraft against the king. And James didn't stop with Agnes. The North Berwick trials continued, sweeping up dozens of people. One notable victim was a woman named Eupheme MacAlzean, a wealthy woman from the nobility who was also accused and burned. Her inclusion shows that while most victims were poor and vulnerable, even wealth and status couldn't always protect you if the king was personally invested in the witch hunt. The North Berwick trials had enormous consequences beyond the immediate victims. King James was so affected by these events that he wrote an entire book about witchcraft called Demonology, published in 1597. In it he argued that witchcraft was real, that witches were in league with Satan, and that they posed a direct threat to Christian monarchs. He provided theological justification for witch hunting and outlined methods for identifying and prosecuting witches. This book became hugely influential. When James became King James I of England in 1603, yes, the same King James who commissioned the King James Bible, he brought his witch-hunting obsession with him. His book and his reputation helped fuel witch trials throughout England and Scotland for decades. The ripple effects of Agnes Sampson's torture and execution touched thousands of lives. But let's zoom out and ask, what was really going on here? Why was Agnes Sampson targeted beyond just being named in a coerced confession? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Agnes represented a category of women that both medical and religious authorities wanted to eliminate. Midwives and wise women held knowledge and power that bypassed official institutions. They didn't need a university degree or church authorization to help people. They operated through community trust and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. And increasingly, as universities began training male physicians and the church consolidated its authority, these women became threats. The witch trials provided a convenient mechanism for eliminating them. Accuse a midwife of witchcraft, torture her until she confesses, execute her, and suddenly there's a job opening that a nice, male, university-trained physician can fill. This pattern repeats across Europe. Study after study has shown that in regions where professional male medicine was trying to establish itself, witch accusations against healers and midwives spiked dramatically. This isn't to say every witch accusation was a deliberate conspiracy by doctors to eliminate competition. Most witch trials were more chaotic and spontaneous than that. But the broader pattern is undeniable. The systematic destruction of female medical knowledge through witch trials paved the way for the male-dominated medical establishment that would control healthcare for centuries. Agnes Sampson wasn't just a witch trial victim. She was a victim of medical misogyny, of the professionalization of medicine that required eliminating female practitioners, of a system that couldn't tolerate women having authority over bodies and birth and healing. Her execution was justified through witchcraft accusations, but the underlying motivation was the same as many modern battles over healthcare. Who gets to have medical authority, and what happens to traditional practitioners when formal institutions want to monopolize care? Moreover, the North Berwick trials show us something we haven't fully addressed in previous stories: the role of royal power in creating and sustaining witch hunts. When a king decides witches are real and targets him personally, entire legal systems bend to accommodate that belief. James had unlimited resources. He could order the most experienced torturers. He could override any skepticism from local authorities. He could personally interrogate prisoners. His fear became law, and his paranoia became policy. This is what happens when conspiracy theories meet absolute power. James genuinely believed in a massive conspiracy of 200 witches gathering to murder him through magic. He believed cats could control weather and wax figures could cause wasting diseases. These beliefs weren't based on evidence. They were based on his reading of continental witch-hunting manuals and his own fear of assassination. But because he was king, these delusions had the force of law. People died because of one man's irrational beliefs backed by state power. Think about the parallels today. When leaders promote conspiracy theories, when paranoia is backed by institutional authority, when personal delusions become policy, the body count rises. We've seen it repeatedly throughout history. Agnes Sampson died not because she'd actually done anything wrong, but because a king needed someone to blame for a storm. The church tried to erase Agnes by burning her body and justifying her execution as necessary. But they also inadvertently preserved her story through the extensive records of her torture and interrogation. Those records are horrifying to read, but they're also evidence. They prove what was done to her. They show the machinery of injustice in brutal detail. In trying to document their righteousness, they documented their crimes. As you're lying there processing this, think about who gets to have medical authority in your community today. Think about how traditional healing practices are dismissed or criminalized while pharmaceutical companies profit. Think about how women's medical knowledge about birth, about herbs, about traditional remedies, is still often devalued compared to institutional medical authority. Agnes Sampson's execution was almost 500 years ago, but the battle over who controls medical knowledge is still being fought. We've now witnessed 8 women destroyed through different mechanisms of witch hunting. But we're not finished yet. Our next story takes us to the most famous witch trials in American history, Salem, Massachusetts. But we're not talking about Tituba this time. We're meeting Bridget Bishop, the very first person executed in Salem, whose crime was wearing red, running a tavern, and being too outspoken for Puritan society's comfort. Her execution opened the floodgates for 18 more deaths. Let's continue, because understanding why Bridget died first helps us understand why anyone died at all. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can do is refuse to be invisible. In Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, being the first person executed in a witch hunt wasn't about being the most guilty. It was about being the most visible, the most memorable, the one everyone already had opinions about. Her name was Bridget Bishop, and on June 10th, 1692, she became the first person hanged during the Salem witch trials. Not because her case was the strongest. It wasn't. Not because her crimes were the worst. They were entirely fabricated. But because Bridget had committed the unforgivable sin of being herself in a community that demanded conformity. She wore bright colours in a place that worshipped grey. She ran a tavern where people had fun in a society that considered enjoyment suspicious. She'd been married 3 times and wasn't ashamed of it. She had a sharp tongue and didn't bow her head. And in Puritan Massachusetts, that was more dangerous than any witchcraft. Bridget's execution opened the floodgates. After she died, the hesitation disappeared. If the courts could hang Bridget Bishop, someone with no confessed sins, no admission of guilt, they could hang anyone. 18 more people would follow her to the gallows over the next 4 months. Her death proved that innocence was no protection, and that realization created a panic that would consume Salem like wildfire. Let's talk about who Bridget actually was, because the Puritans tried very hard to erase the real woman and replace her with a demonic caricature. Bridget was probably in her 50s or 60s by 1692. We don't know her exact age because women's births weren't always recorded as carefully as men's. She'd been married 3 times, which immediately made her suspicious. Her first husband died. Her second husband died. Her third husband, Edward Bishop, was still alive, though they'd had conflicts that became public knowledge. She owned and operated a tavern, or what some records call a house of entertainment, in Salem town. Now, taverns in Puritan Massachusetts were complicated spaces. They were necessary for travellers and for conducting business, but they were also places where people drank alcohol, played games, and socialised in ways that nervous church authorities found threatening. Bridget's tavern apparently allowed shuffleboard, a game where you slide weights across a board, which the Puritans considered gambling and therefore sinful. There were reports of people carousing at her establishment, of laughter and noise late into the night. But here's what really made Bridget stand out. She wore a red bodice. Not occasionally, not for special occasions, regularly. In a community where everyone wore black, grey or brown, where modesty was enforced through social pressure and sometimes law, Bridget wore bright red. Can you imagine how visible that made her? How every time she walked down the street people noticed? In a society built on uniformity and self-erasure, Bridget was impossible to ignore. This wasn't accidental. Bridget knew exactly what she was doing. She was making a statement. I exist. I'm here. You will see me. In our modern context, that seems like basic self-expression. In Puritan Salem, it was rebellion. It was saying, "Your rules don't control me," which was the most dangerous thing a woman could say. And Salem had noticed. Bridget had actually been accused of witchcraft before, back in 1680. She'd been examined, questioned, and ultimately released without formal charges. But that accusation stuck in community memory. Once you've been called a witch, even if cleared, that label haunts you. People remember. They watch you differently. They interpret everything you do through that lens. So when the witch hunt erupted again in 1692, Bridget was already on the list. The accusations against her were a greatest hits compilation of witch trial clichés. Samuel Gray testified that Bridget's spectre, her ghost or spirit, had visited him one night and attacked him in his bed. He woke up unable to move, feeling a weight on his chest, terrified. Now, what he was describing is what we'd call sleep paralysis, a well-documented phenomenon where your brain wakes up before your body, creating a sensation of being held down, often accompanied by hallucinations. But in 1692, Salem, it was witchcraft. William Stacy claimed that 14 years earlier, Bridget had bought a pig from him. He said the pig had strange behaviour, and then, and I'm not making this up, the pig's ghost haunted him. A ghost pig. This was admitted as evidence in a capital trial. The pig hadn't even died mysteriously, it was just a pig. But because Bridget had owned it, and because William had bad luck afterward, clearly she'd bewitched his pig. Multiple people testified that Bridget's spectre appeared to them at night, threatening them, trying to get them to sign the devil's book. John Lauder said her spectre came into his room and he couldn't move. Samuel Shattuck's son got sick after an argument with Bridget, and obviously that meant she'd cursed him. Richard Coman testified that after an interaction with Bridget, his cartwheels fell off and his animals went wild. Because apparently Bridget had the time and inclination to go around hexing people's transportation, during her examination on April 19, 1692, the afflicted girls, the same ones who'd accused Tituba and others, were brought in, and they put on quite a show. Every time Bridget moved, they'd shriek and fall down, claiming her movements were tormenting them. When she looked at them, they'd scream that her eyes were like daggers. When she turned away, they'd cry that she was sending her spectre to attack them. If Bridget bit her lip, the girls claimed to feel biting sensations. If she clasped her hands, they'd say their hands were being crushed. Think about this for a second. You're Bridget, standing in a room full of people, trying to defend yourself, and everything you do, literally every physical movement, is being used as evidence that you're attacking people through invisible means. How do you defend against that? You can't. If you stand still, you're being defiant and suspicious. If you move, you're attacking through witchcraft. If you speak, you're lying. If you stay silent, you're guilty. There's no winning move. The magistrates asked her the standard questions. "Are you a witch?" She said no. "Have you made a covenant with the devil?" "No. Why do you seem to have no sorrow for these afflicted persons?" She responded reasonably that she had no reason to be sorry because she hadn't done anything to them. This was interpreted as coldness and lack of Christian sympathy, more evidence against her. They searched her body for witch marks and found what they claimed were supernatural teats, where familiar spirits could suckle. These were probably hemorrhoids or skin tags, normal bodily features that every elderly person develops. But to the examiners, they were proof positive of demonic activity. Bridget was sent to jail to await trial. In prison, she was chained. The conditions were horrendous: cold, damp, minimal food, no sanitation. Multiple accused witches would die in these prisons before ever reaching trial. But Bridget survived until June 2nd, when her case came before the newly formed Court of Oyer and Termina, literally to hear and determine, a special court created specifically to handle the witchcraft crisis. The trial was presided over by William Stoughton, who was absolutely convinced that witches were real and everywhere. The jury heard all the spectral evidence, the dreams, the visions, the accusations of ghost attacks. They heard about the red bodice and the tavern and the shuffleboard. They heard that she'd been accused before in 1680. They heard from the afflicted girls who continued their theatrical performances. Bridget's defence was simple. She was innocent. She'd done nothing wrong. But in Salem in June 1692 that wasn't enough. The jury found her guilty of witchcraft. On June 8th, the death warrant was signed. On June 10th, 1692, she was taken to Gallows Hill, a rocky outcropping on the edge of Salem, and hanged. The execution was public. The community watched. Bridget maintained her innocence to the end. The noose was placed around her neck. The ladder was removed. She died by slow strangulation. Hanging wasn't the quick neck break of later execution methods, but rather minutes of choking as her body weight cut off her airway. It would have been agonizing. The crowd would have watched her struggle, her body convulse, until finally she went still. Her body was buried in a shallow grave on Gallows Hill, without ceremony, without Christian burial, because witches didn't deserve dignity even in death. Years later, her family allegedly retrieved her body and gave her a proper burial, but we don't know where. Bridget Bishop doesn't have a marked grave. The church and community erased even that final memorial. Here's what makes Bridget's execution historically crucial. She was the first, and her death changed everything. Before June 10th, there had been accusations, arrests, examinations, imprisonments. But no one had actually been executed yet. There was still theoretical space for the authorities to step back, to question whether they were going too far. Cotton Mather, one of the ministers involved in the trials, actually expressed some reservations after Bridget's conviction about whether spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions, should be enough to justify execution. But then they killed her anyway. And once that line was crossed, once someone had actually died, it became psychologically necessary to justify it. If Bridget was innocent, then the magistrates and judges were murderers. That couldn't be true. They were godly men, community leaders, doing God's work. So Bridget must have been guilty. And if Bridget was guilty, then all the other accused must be guilty too. Her execution validated the process, making the next 18 hangings almost inevitable. This is the psychology of escalation. Once you've killed someone, you're committed. You can't admit doubt without admitting culpability, so you keep going, each execution justifying the previous one, each death making it harder to stop. Bridget was the first domino, and her fall guaranteed all the others would follow. But why was Bridget chosen to be first? Why not someone who'd confessed, like Tituba? Why not someone with a worse reputation? Because Bridget represented everything Puritan society feared about female autonomy. She was economically independent, running her own business. She'd survived multiple husbands and didn't seem diminished by it. If anything, she seemed to thrive. She dressed how she wanted. She spoke her mind. She hosted a space where people enjoyed themselves. She was visible and unapologetic. In a society built on female submission, silence, and self-erasure, Bridget was a walking rebellion. Her execution sent a message. This is what happens to women who don't conform. This is what happens when you wear red instead of grey, when you run a business instead of staying home, when you survive independently instead of remarrying quickly, when you speak boldly instead of whispering. The message was clear: be invisible or die. This is different from all our previous stories in a crucial way. Alice Keitler's wealth threatened male inheritance. Joan of Arc's military leadership challenged gender roles and political authority. Isabel Godey's confession was a mystery of storytelling. Tituba was scapegoated for race. Agnes Waterhouse set legal precedent. Anna Goldie was destroyed for sexual inconvenience. Merlin was betrayed by family. Agnes Sampson represented medical knowledge that threatened professional male doctors. But Bridget's crime was joy. Her crime was visibility. Her crime was refusing to disappear. The tavern she ran was a space of happiness in a society that considered happiness suspicious. The red bodice was a splash of colour in a world that demanded grey. Her survival as a widow without remarrying proved women didn't need husbands to exist. Every aspect of Bridget's life threatened the Puritan worldview, not because she was doing anything actively harmful, but because she existed loudly in a system that required women to exist quietly. After Bridget's execution, the trials accelerated. 5 more people were hanged on July 19th, 5 more on August 19th, 8 more on September 22nd. By the time the trials finally ended in October, 19 people had been hanged, 1 man had been pressed to death under heavy stones, and at least 5 more had died in prison. All because Bridget wore red and owned a tavern. The church tried to erase Bridget by denying her Christian burial and justifying her execution as righteous. Salem tried to erase her by destroying her tavern and scattering any memory of where she was buried. But Bridget's legacy persisted because her execution was so obviously, grotesquely unjust that it eventually helped end the trials. When people began questioning the Salem witch hunt, Bridget's case was one of the clearest examples of how wrong it had all been. An older woman killed for wearing red and serving drinks. Even contemporaries eventually had to admit that made no sense. In 1711, Massachusetts passed legislation providing restitution to the families of those executed in Salem. Bridget Bishop's name was on that list. The colony essentially admitted they'd murdered her, but she was still dead, and the apology came 19 years too late. Think about who we punish today for visibility. Think about women who are too loud, too colourful, too successful, too happy. Think about how we still police female joy and independence, how women are told to be modest, quiet, humble, invisible. The mechanics have changed. We don't hang people for wearing red anymore, but the underlying message persists. Women who refuse to disappear are threatening. Bridget Bishop wore red in a world of grey and died for it. But every woman who's ever chosen visibility over invisibility, joy over submission, colour over conformity, is walking in Bridget's footsteps. The church tried to erase her, but she's more remembered now than any of the judges who condemned her. We've covered 9 women now, each destroyed by different aspects of witch-hunting machinery. But we have 3 more stories to tell, and they're crucial. Our next story brings us to someone whose case made people finally question whether any of this made sense. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, bedridden with illness, a church member with an impeccable reputation for kindness and piety. When Salem accused and executed her, even some of the accusers began to doubt. Her story shows us the moment when witch hunting finally became too monstrous for even true believers to ignore. Stay with me, because Rebecca's execution marked the beginning of the end for Salem's madness. If goodness could save you, Rebecca Nurse would have lived. If a lifetime of service could protect you, she would have died peacefully in her bed, surrounded by family. If prayers and piety mattered more than hysteria, the jury would never have convicted her. But on July 19th, 1692, a 71-year-old woman who could barely walk was dragged to Gallows Hill and hanged alongside 4 other victims. And when Rebecca Nurse died, this beloved grandmother, this faithful church member, this woman whom even her accusers had once respected, something broke in Salem. People began asking the question that would eventually end the trials. If she can be a witch, can anyone truly be innocent? Rebecca's execution was the turning point. Before her, you could argue that the condemned had been suspicious. Bridget with her red bodice and tavern, Tituba with her foreign practices. But Rebecca made no sense. And when a system stops making sense even to its supporters, that system is already dying. It just doesn't know it yet. Let's talk about who Rebecca was before she became victim number 7 in Salem's killing spree. She was born Rebecca Town around 1621 in Yarmouth, England, and came to Massachusetts as a young woman. In 1644, at about 23 years old, she married Francis Nurse, and together they built a life that was, by all accounts, exemplary by Puritan standards. They had 8 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, which in the 17th century was remarkable and seen as a sign of God's favour. They were devout, attending church regularly, participating in all the religious and community activities expected of them. Francis and Rebecca worked hard and managed to acquire a 300-acre farm in Salem Village. This was substantial property, making them relatively prosperous by colonial standards. But here's something crucial. They weren't ostentatiously wealthy or politically powerful like Alice Keitler. They were what we'd call solid middle class, respected, stable, the kind of people who form the backbone of the community. Rebecca was known for her acts of charity, for helping sick neighbours, for being a voice of calm and reason in disputes. When Cotton Mather later tried to justify the Salem trials, even he had trouble with Rebecca's case because her reputation was too good to easily destroy. By 1692, Rebecca was 71 years old and suffering from what historical medical analysis suggests was probably severe arthritis or rheumatism. She was partially deaf. She spent much of her time bedridden or in a chair. This is important because it makes the accusations against her almost comically implausible. We're supposed to believe that a 71-year-old woman who could barely walk was flying around at night attacking people in their beds. The accusations against Rebecca began in March 1692. Ann Putnam Jr., yes, the same 12-year-old we mentioned in Tituba's story, claimed that Rebecca's spectre was tormenting her. This is where family politics enters the picture in a way we haven't fully explored yet. The Putnam family and the Nurse family had a long-standing property dispute. The Putnams believed some of the land the Nurses owned should rightfully be theirs. There had been legal battles, angry words, the kind of multi-generational feuding that small communities specialise in. Ann Putnam Jr. was the daughter of Thomas Putnam and Ann Putnam Sr., both of whom were deeply invested in the witchcraft accusations. In fact, Ann Putnam Sr., the mother, also claimed to be afflicted and made accusations. So you have a mother-daughter team accusing people, and one of their primary targets is a family they've been fighting with over land for years. Convenient, isn't it? But wait, it gets worse. Edward Putnam and Jonathan Putnam, relatives of Anne's family, were the ones who filed the official complaint against Rebecca. They were using the witchcraft trials as a weapon in a property dispute. This is the witch-hunting equivalent of calling the HOA on your neighbour because their fence is 6 inches over the property line, except instead of a fine, the penalty is death by hanging. When Rebecca was arrested on March 23, 1692, the community was shocked. This wasn't Bridget Bishop with her red bodice. This wasn't some marginalised outsider. This was Rebecca Nurse, beloved grandmother, church stalwart. 39 people signed a petition attesting to her good character. 39 people were willing to put their names on a document defending an accused witch, which took enormous courage given the climate of fear in Salem at the time. The petition is beautifully written and heartbreaking to read. It describes Rebecca as someone who had lived according to the rules of the gospel amongst us, as a woman of unspotted reputation, whose conversation and bearing were Christian and exemplary. These weren't her family members trying to save her. These were neighbours, community members, people who'd known her for decades. They were essentially saying, "You've made a terrible mistake. This woman is not a witch." Rebecca's examination on March 24th was chaotic and disturbing. The afflicted girls, Ann Putnam Jr., Abigail Williams and others, were brought in and immediately began their performances. They shrieked, fell down, claimed to be pinched and bitten by Rebecca's spectre. Remember, Rebecca was 71, partially deaf and visibly frail. She was confused by the accusations, struggling to understand what was being said because of her hearing problems, exhausted from the ordeal. At one point during the examination, when asked if she was guilty, Rebecca said something that was recorded as, "What do you do? Do you do?" Historians debate what she meant. Was she asking the magistrates what they were doing to her? Was it confusion? Was it a statement lost to history because the recorder didn't capture it properly? The afflicted girls immediately claimed that Rebecca was summoning her familiars by saying, "Do you do?" It's absurd on its face, but in that courtroom it became evidence. The magistrates pressed her. Why did the girls suffer when she came near? Rebecca responded with devastating logic. "I cannot help it if the devil appears in my shape." This is the central impossibility of spectral evidence. If the devil can appear in anyone's form, if he can impersonate innocent people to commit crimes, then how can you prove innocence? Rebecca was essentially pointing out the logical flaw that would eventually undermine the entire trial structure. But in March 1692, no one was ready to hear it. Rebecca was sent to prison to await trial. In her cell, she was chained. At 71, with limited mobility and hearing loss, she endured the cold, the darkness, the terror. Her family visited when they could, bringing food and warm clothing, but she spent months in these conditions, and throughout it all she maintained her innocence. Her trial took place on June 29th, 1692. The jury heard the spectral evidence from the afflicted girls. They heard about the property disputes with the Putnam family, though that context was framed as Rebecca bearing grudges, not the Putnams weaponizing the trials. They heard testimony about strange illnesses that had befallen neighbours, all attributed to Rebecca's witchcraft. And then something extraordinary happened. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Stop and think about this. A Salem jury, in the middle of the witch hunt hysteria, surrounded by screaming afflicted girls and pressure from magistrates, found Rebecca Nurse not guilty. It's one of the only times during the entire Salem episode that a jury chose reason over panic. For a brief moment it looked like Rebecca would survive, that common sense would prevail, that 39 character witnesses and a lifetime of good works would count for something. But Chief Justice William Stoughton wasn't having it. He stood up and essentially told the jury they'd made a mistake. He directed their attention to something Rebecca had said during trial. When another accused woman, Deliverance Hobbs, was brought into the courtroom, Rebecca had reportedly said, "What do you bring her? She is one of us." The magistrates interpreted "one of us" to mean one of us witches. proof that Rebecca was admitting to being part of a coven. What did Rebecca actually mean? Almost certainly, one of us accused, or one of us being persecuted. She was expressing sympathy for a fellow victim. But the magistrates twisted it into a confession, and Judge Stoughton told the jury to reconsider their verdict in light of this evidence. The jury deliberated again, under enormous pressure from the court, with the judge essentially telling them they were wrong. They changed their verdict. Rebecca Nurse was now guilty of witchcraft. When Rebecca heard the verdict, she was so shocked and distressed that she couldn't speak. Her family frantically tried to explain to the court what she'd meant by one of us. But it was too late. The machinery of execution had been set in motion. There was one last hope. Governor William Phipps, who'd established the court of Oyer and Termina that was conducting these trials, granted Rebecca a temporary reprieve. For a brief moment it seemed she might be saved. But the afflicted girls immediately had fits and seizures, screaming that Rebecca's spectre was tormenting them even from jail. The community pressure was immense. Within days, Phipps withdrew the reprieve. Rebecca Nurse would hang. Before her execution, the church held a special meeting to excommunicate her. Think about the cruelty of this. It wasn't enough to kill her body. They wanted to damn her soul. Excommunication meant she was cut off from the church, from Christian community, theoretically from salvation itself. They stripped her of her church membership, declaring that she'd been a secret servant of Satan all along. This woman, who'd attended services faithfully for decades, who'd raised 8 Christian children, who'd been known for her piety, they declared her an enemy of God. On July 19th, 1692, Rebecca was taken to Gallows Hill, along with 4 others, Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, and Susanna Martin. 5 women hanged together that day. Rebecca was so weak that she had to be helped onto the cart that carried them to execution. At Gallows Hill, Reverend Nicholas Noyes presided over the executions. After the women were hanged, he reportedly said, "What a sad thing it is to see 8 firebrands of hell hanging there." 8 firebrands of hell. That's what he called them. Not victims, not fellow Christians who deserved compassion. Firebrands of hell. The dehumanization was complete. Rebecca's family wasn't allowed to give her a Christian burial in the church cemetery. Her body was thrown into a shallow grave on Gallows Hill with the other executed witches. But late one night, under cover of darkness, her family allegedly dug up her body and reburied her on their property. They couldn't give her a marked grave. That would have been too dangerous. But they wanted her to rest in ground that had known her footsteps, surrounded by land she'd worked. The exact location of this secret grave was passed down through family oral history, but never publicly revealed. Here's what makes Rebecca's case different from all our previous stories. She represents the moment when witch-hunting logic collapses under its own absurdity. With Alice Keitler, you could argue wealth and power were threatening. With Joan of Arc, military authority. With Isabel Gowdy, the confessions seemed to confirm guilt. With Tituba, racial scapegoating. With Agnes Waterhouse, she'd been found with evidence. With Anna Goldie, sexual scandal. With Malin Matsdotter, family accusations. With Agnes Sampson, royal paranoia. With Bridget Bishop, visible nonconformity. But Rebecca had nothing suspicious about her. She was exactly what Puritan society claimed to value: pious, charitable, family-oriented, humble. If Rebecca Nurse was a witch, then the concept of witch had become meaningless. If she could be convicted, then innocence itself was impossible, and people began to notice. After Rebecca's execution, doubt began creeping into Salem. Not immediately. 8 more people would be hanged in August and September. But the certainty started cracking. Some of the jury members later expressed regret. Thomas Fiske, one of the jurors who'd convicted Rebecca, publicly apologized, saying he'd been pressured and manipulated. The 39 people who'd signed her petition knew they'd witnessed a judicial murder. The afflicted girls kept making accusations, but people started questioning whether these girls were reliable witnesses. If they could accuse Rebecca Nurse, then maybe they could accuse anyone. Maybe the problem wasn't hidden witches in the community. Maybe the problem was the system itself. By October 1692, the trials were winding down. Governor Phipps, facing increasing criticism, and with his own wife now accused, dissolved the court of Oyer and Termina. Remaining prisoners were gradually released. The hysteria that had killed 20 people over 7 months finally burned itself out. In 1711, Massachusetts passed legislation acknowledging that the trials had been wrong. Rebecca Nurse's name was officially cleared, and her family received £25 in restitution, a pitiful amount that did nothing to bring her back or undo the trauma. In 1712, the Church reversed her excommunication, restoring her membership posthumously, 20 years too late. In 1796, Rebecca's descendants erected a monument on the family property, marking the approximate location of her secret grave. It reads, Rebecca Nurse, Yarmouth, England, 1621. Salem, Mass, 1692. Christian martyr, July 19th, 1692. It's one of the few memorials to Salem victims erected by their own families. The Church tried to erase Rebecca through excommunication and unmarked burial. Salem tried to erase her by justifying her execution as righteous. But Rebecca's story became the one that people couldn't forget or rationalize away. When Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, he made Rebecca Nurse's execution the moral center of the play, the moment when the audience realizes the entire system is unjust. She became a symbol of innocence destroyed, of goodness unrewarded, of a system that had spiraled so far into madness that it killed its best citizens. What Rebecca's story teaches us is that witch hunts don't care about actual guilt or innocence. They care about maintaining the system itself. Once the machine starts running, it needs to be fed. Stopping would require admitting that previous executions were wrong, and that admission is psychologically unbearable for those in power. So the system demands more victims, more confessions, more executions, each one justifying the previous ones, until the logic becomes so circular and self-serving that even true believers can't maintain it. Think about modern systems that operate on similar logic. Think about how institutions resist admitting past mistakes because correction would require accountability. Think about how tough-on-crime policies escalate even when evidence shows they don't work, because stopping would mean admitting we've been doing it wrong. Think about how ideological purges, whether in corporations, politics, or social movements, accelerate until they consume even the most loyal members, at which point people finally say, wait, this has gone too far. Rebecca Nurse was that breaking point for Salem. Her death was so obviously grotesquely wrong that it planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into widespread repudiation of the trials. But she was still dead. The apology came 20 years too late. The exoneration couldn't give her back the last months of her life, spent chained in a freezing cell, or the dignity of dying peacefully surrounded by family. As you're processing these 10 stories, think about who we still refuse to believe. Think about who tells the truth and is called a liar. Think about who lives exemplary lives but is still destroyed because the system needs a victim. Rebecca Nurse's story is almost 400 years old, but the patterns it reveals are depressingly contemporary. We have 2 more stories left in our journey through history's erased witches, and they'll complete the picture we've been building. Next, we're travelling to Germany to meet a woman whose professional success made her a target in one of the most brutal witch hunts in European history. Katharina Henot ran an imperial postal service, wielded real economic power, and lived in Cologne at the height of German witch-hunting mania. Her story will show us how professional jealousy and economic competition drove witch accusations, and why successful women in male-dominated fields have always had targets on their backs. Stay with me, we're almost done, and these final stories matter. Success is dangerous. Not the quiet kind of success, where you keep your head down and no one notices. The loud kind. The kind where you're so competent, so visible, so undeniably good at your job that people can't ignore you. And when that successful person is a woman in a man's world, success becomes a death sentence. 1627, Cologne, Germany. At the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, in one of its most important cities, a woman runs the imperial postal service, not assists with it, not helps manage it, runs it. She handles correspondence between kings and princes, merchants and diplomats. She knows everyone's secrets because she controls the flow of information. She's wealthy, respected, and powerful. Her name is Katharina Henot, and within months, her male rivals will use the one weapon that's proven effective against successful women throughout history. They'll call her a witch. And in 1627, Germany, ground zero for the European witch craze, that accusation is as good as a death warrant. Katharina's story reveals something we've touched on but haven't fully explored: the economics of witch hunting. Because when you dig into the numbers, when you follow the money, witch trials become less about Satan and more about wealth redistribution. And Katharina had wealth that a lot of men wanted. Let's establish context, because Germany in the 1620s was witch-hunting hell on earth. While we've talked about trials in Scotland, England, Salem, those were terrible, but they were contained. Germany was different. Germany was industrial-scale persecution. Between 1550 and 1650, historians estimate that 40,000 people were executed for witchcraft in German territories. 40,000. That's more than the rest of Europe combined. Some regions conducted mass trials where dozens or even hundreds of people were burned at once. Why was Germany so extreme? Several factors. First, political fragmentation. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of semi-independent territories, each with its own prince or bishop who could conduct trials without much oversight. Second, the 30 Years' War had just begun in 1618, bringing chaos, famine, and plague. When life is terrible and no one can explain why, people look for scapegoats. Third, there was money in it. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their property was confiscated and divided between the accusers, the court, and the local authorities. Witch hunting was profitable. Into this environment came Katharina Henot. She was born into a wealthy family in Cologne, probably in the 1570s. Her father, Jakob Henot, had been the imperial postmaster before her, managing the postal routes that connected Cologne to the rest of the empire. When he died, Katharina, who'd apparently been working alongside him and knew the business inside and out, took over. This wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of either. Widows and daughters sometimes inherited family businesses, especially in commercial centres like Cologne, where practical competence mattered more than gender ideology. Katharina was good at her job, really good. The postal service under her management was efficient, reliable, and profitable. She had connections with merchants, nobles, and government officials across the empire. She employed several people. She owned property in Cologne. By all accounts, she was respected in business circles, which meant she was making money and wielding influence in spaces that were supposed to be exclusively male, and that's where the problem started. Because Katerina had something that her male competitors wanted: her position. The imperial postal service was lucrative and prestigious. Running it meant access to information, connections, and substantial income. Several men in Cologne wanted that job, and Katerina was in their way. The specific details of how the accusations against Katerina began are murky because, surprise, many of the records were destroyed or lost. But we know that in 1627, during one of Cologne's periodic witch-hunting surges, Katerina's name came up. Someone accused her of witchcraft. Once accused, the machinery took over. Here's how witch trials worked in 1620s Germany, and why they were so horrific. The trial would begin with an accusation, often from someone with a grudge or financial interest. The accused would be arrested and imprisoned. Then the torture would start. German witch hunters used systematic, documented torture protocols that were designed to extract confessions. They had manuals, they had best practices, they'd refined the process over decades. The torture typically began with lighter methods: sleep deprivation, shaving the body to search for witch marks, thumb screws. If the accused didn't confess, they'd escalate to the strappado, hanging by the wrists with weights attached to the feet, dislocating shoulders. If that didn't work, they'd use the rack, stretching the body until joints separated. They'd use leg screws that crushed calves and shins. They'd use heated metal implements. They'd continue until the person either confessed or died from the torture. But here's the truly diabolical part. You had to confess to specific things. It wasn't enough to say, "Yes, I'm a witch." You had to name your accomplices. You had to describe the Sabbath you'd attended. You had to detail the crimes you'd committed through witchcraft. This created a chain reaction. Every confession generated more names, more arrests, more trials, more confiscations of property. It was a perpetual motion machine of persecution and profit. Katerina was tortured. We don't know exactly which methods were used on her because the detailed trial records are lost, but we know the outcome. She confessed. Under torture, she admitted to being a witch. She probably named accomplices. Most torture victims did, naming anyone they could think of to make the pain stop. And once she'd confessed, her fate was sealed. The court found her guilty of witchcraft and sentenced her to death by burning. On May 19th, 1627, Katerina Henop was taken to the execution ground in Cologne. The method in Germany was typically to strangle the victim first, a small mercy, and then burn the body. But sometimes, if the authorities wanted to make an example, or if the supposed crimes were particularly heinous, they'd burn the person alive. We don't know which fate Katerina suffered. What we do know is that after her execution, her property was confiscated. Her position was given to someone else, a man, naturally. The postal service she'd run so successfully was taken over by people who'd been her competitors. Her wealth was distributed among the court officials, the executioners, and the accusers. Katerina was erased, and men profited from her erasure. Here's the part that should make you furious. There's significant historical debate about whether Katerina's persecution was driven by genuine belief in witchcraft or by economic and professional jealousy. Many historians who've studied her case believe the witchcraft accusation was a pretext, a tool to remove a successful woman from a position that men wanted. The accusers might have genuinely believed in witchcraft, or they might have cynically used it as a weapon, knowing it would work. Either way, the result was the same. a competent woman was murdered and her position was claimed by men. This is different from all our previous stories in a crucial way. We've seen witch accusations driven by many things: wealth, Alice Keitler; political threat, Joan of Arc; community scapegoating, Agnes Waterhouse; racial targeting, Tituba; sexual exploitation, Anna Goldie; family betrayal, Malin Matsdotter; medical competition, Agnes Sampson; visible nonconformity, Bridget Bishop; and system collapse, Rebecca Nurse. But Katharina's story is specifically about professional jealousy and job competition. She had a position that men wanted, and they used witch accusations to eliminate her and take it. This reveals something about witch trials that's often overlooked in the focus on theology and superstition. They were economic weapons. Executing someone for witchcraft wasn't just about religious purity or community safety. It was about redistributing wealth and power. In Germany especially, where the confiscation of property was standard practice, witch trials functioned as a form of legalized theft. Accuse someone wealthy, torture them until they confess, execute them, take their stuff, repeat. And women were particularly vulnerable to this because they often inherited property or positions that male relatives felt should have gone to them. When a widow inherited her husband's business, male family members or competitors might see a witch accusation as a way to correct that inheritance. When a daughter ran a family enterprise, male rivals could use accusations to claim what they thought was rightfully theirs by virtue of their gender. Think about the scale of this for a moment. Germany executed 40,000 people for witchcraft between 1550 and 1650. A significant percentage of those were women who owned property or businesses. Every execution meant property changing hands, wealth being redistributed, economic positions opening up. Witch trials in Germany weren't just religious persecution. They were one of the largest forced wealth transfers in European history, and it disproportionately moved resources from women to men. Katharina's case also shows us something about visibility and vulnerability. She wasn't hiding her competence. She wasn't pretending to be less capable than she was. She was openly running a major imperial institution, making business decisions, wielding authority. In a different time or place that might have been celebrated. But in 1627, Cologne, during a witch-hunting surge, her visibility made her a target. This is the impossible position of ambitious women throughout history. Hide your competence and be overlooked and underpaid, or display your competence and become threatening. Katharina chose to be excellent at her job, and it killed her. How many other women throughout history have faced that same calculation and chosen invisibility to stay alive? The church and authorities tried to erase Katharina not just through execution, but through justification. The official narrative was that she'd been a secret servant of Satan, that her success had been demonic in origin, that removing her had purified the community. But even at the time, some people weren't buying it. There are records of citizens questioning her conviction, suggesting that jealousy and greed had motivated the accusations rather than genuine concerns about witchcraft. Fast forward to 2012, almost 400 years after her execution, the city of Cologne officially rehabilitated Katharina Henot, acknowledging that her trial and execution had been unjust. There's now a memorial to her in Cologne. In 2015, she was symbolically made an honorary citizen of the city. Better late than never, I suppose, except Katharina is still dead, and the men who profited from her murder were never held accountable. Modern scholarship on Katharina's case has focused on documenting exactly how economic motives drove witch accusations. Researchers have traced property transfers, identified the men who benefited from her execution, and pieced together a picture of systematic persecution for profit. It's damning evidence that witch trials, at least in Germany, were often more about economics than theology. But here's what keeps me up at night about Katharina's story. How contemporary does this feel? Think about women in corporate leadership positions today. Think about how often successful women face accusations designed to destroy their credibility and remove them from power, not witchcraft anymore, but being difficult, aggressive, not a team player, emotional. Think about how women who succeed in male-dominated fields face constant scrutiny that their male counterparts never experience. Think about how whistleblowers who expose corruption are destroyed rather than protected. The tools have changed. We don't burn people anymore, at least not literally. But the pattern persists. A woman succeeds in a space where men think they should dominate, and suddenly accusations emerge that are designed not to address any real problem, but to remove her from power. The accusations might be about her personality, her management style, her aggressive communication, none of which would be considered problematic in a man, or they might be outright fabrications, knowing that once the accusations are public, the damage is done even if she's later cleared. Katharina Henot ran an imperial postal service with competence and efficiency, and they burned her for it. How many modern Katharinas have been forced out of their positions, their reputations destroyed, their careers ended, because they threatened someone else's claim to power? How many women have looked at Katharina's fate, in whatever contemporary form it takes, and decided that excellence wasn't worth the risk? The economics of persecution haven't changed. When someone has something you want, a job, wealth, influence, respect, and you can't compete fairly, you destroy them through accusations that exploit existing prejudices. In 1627, it was witchcraft. Today, it might be claims about culture fit or leadership style, or anonymous accusations that conveniently emerge right when a woman is up for promotion. The mechanics are the same. Identify a vulnerability, weaponize prejudice, eliminate the competition, profit from their removal. As you're processing Katharina's story, think about who we allow to have professional authority and who we question. Think about how success is celebrated in men and suspicious in women. Think about how often we see successful women face accusations, whether formal or informal, legal or social, that seem designed to cut them down rather than address genuine concerns. Think about who benefits when successful women are removed from positions of power, and how often those benefits flow to men who are their competitors. Katharina Henot deserved better. She deserved to run her postal service, to live out her life in the prosperity she'd earned, to die peacefully knowing her competence had been recognized and valued. Instead, she was tortured and burned, her position was taken, her wealth was stolen, and her story was erased for 400 years. The church and the city of Cologne tried to pretend she'd never existed, or if she had, that her execution had been righteous. It took until 2012 for anyone to officially admit what had really happened. Murder disguised as justice, theft disguised as religious purification, professional jealousy disguised as witch hunting. We've covered 11 stories now, 11 women destroyed by different aspects of witch hunting machinery. But we have one final story that will bring everything together. We've seen individual persecution, but what about the collective? What about the thousands of women whose names we don't know, who left no records, who were erased so completely that we can barely prove they existed? Our final chapter is about them, the forgotten thousands whose stories the church tried hardest to erase, and why remembering them matters more than ever. This is where everything we've learned comes together, so stay with me for this last essential piece. We've spent over 2 hours together now, you and I, walking through the stories of 11 women who were accused, tortured, and killed for witchcraft. 11 names: Alice, Joan, Isabel, Tituba, Agnes Waterhouse, Anna, Marlin, Agnes Sampson, Bridget, Rebecca, and Katharina. 11 lives cut short. 11 families destroyed. 11 community complicit. But here's the truth that should shake you to your core. For every woman whose name we remember, there are hundreds whose names are lost forever. For every detailed trial record that survived, there are dozens that were destroyed or never written at all. For every story we can tell, there are countless stories that died with the women who lived them. Between 1450 and 1750, 300 years, approximately 100,000 people were prosecuted for witchcraft in Europe and colonial America. Of those, between 40,000 and 60,000 were executed, and we know the names of maybe a few hundred. The rest? Gone, erased, forgotten. Their voices silenced not just by execution but by the deliberate destruction of records, the indifference of history, and the Church's desire to move on without accountability. This final chapter is for them, for the thousands of women, and yes, some men, who died unnamed, unremembered, whose final words were never recorded, whose families were too terrified or too ashamed to speak of them, whose graves are unmarked or lost. This is for the women who don't get the historical re-evaluation, the museum exhibits, the exonerations. This is for the erased. Let's start with the numbers, because they're staggering. 80% of those executed for witchcraft were women. 80%. And the patterns are consistent across different countries and centuries. They were disproportionately elderly, over 40, often over 60. They were disproportionately poor, though not exclusively. They were disproportionately widowed or unmarried. They were disproportionately outspoken, unconventional or socially marginal. They were healers, midwives, herbalists. They were women who owned property. They were women who spoke too loudly, dressed too boldly, laughed too freely, or simply survived too long. What unites all these women, the named and the nameless, is that they threatened someone or something. Maybe they threatened male authority by having knowledge or power. Maybe they threatened community cohesion by being different. Maybe they threatened inheritance by outliving their usefulness. Maybe they threatened religious conformity by practicing folk traditions. Maybe they simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time when someone needed a scapegoat. Think about what we've learned through our 11 stories. We've seen witch accusations weaponized for wealth confiscation, political elimination, racial scapegoating, medical monopolization, sexual control, family destruction, professional competition, and community purification. Witch hunting wasn't one thing. It was a Swiss Army knife of persecution, a multi-purpose tool that could be adapted to eliminate whoever needed eliminating for whatever reason. That's why it persisted for 3 centuries. That's why it killed so many. It was useful. And the Church, whether Catholic or Protestant, provided the theological justification, the legal framework, and often the personnel to make it happen. They wrote the manuals, like the Malleus Maleficarum published in 1486, that explained how to identify witches, extract confessions, and execute them properly. They trained the inquisitors and witch-finders. They blessed the executions and declared them righteous. And then, when witch-hunting finally became too embarrassing to continue, they destroyed the records and pretended it had never been that bad. 90% of Scottish witch trials have no recorded outcome. 90%. We know people were arrested, we know they were charged, but we don't know if they were executed, imprisoned, released, or what happened to them. The records simply stop. Entire lives reduced to arrested for witchcraft, with no resolution, no closure, no justice, just silence. In Germany, where 40,000 people were executed, 40,000, we know the names of maybe 2,000 or 3,000. The rest are statistical abstractions. They're numbers in historical analysis. There are approximately 12 women burned in this village in 1631 without any individual identity. Imagine being one of those 12 women. Imagine your final moments being torture and fire, and then 400 years later, you're not even a name. You're just part of a number that historians cite to prove how bad things were. The erasure was systematic and deliberate. Trial records were destroyed, sometimes immediately after executions, sometimes years later when communities wanted to forget their participation in mass murder. Church records were cleaned to remove embarrassing entries. Family histories were sanitized. Descendants didn't want to be associated with executed witches, so those branches of family trees simply disappeared from the record. Graves were unmarked or destroyed. Even oral traditions faded as communities collectively chose amnesia over accountability. But sometimes, fragments survive. A name in a parish record, a property transfer that notes confiscated from executed witch, a diary entry from someone who witnessed an execution, a folk song that remembers a local wise woman who disappeared. These fragments are precious because they prove these women existed. They're evidence against erasure. Modern historians and genealogists have been working to recover these names, to piece together the lost stories. Projects like the Survey of Scottish Witchcraft have documented nearly 4,000 accused witches in Scotland alone, cross-referencing church records, court documents, and local histories. Similar projects exist for other regions. It's painstaking work, and it's incomplete. It will always be incomplete because so much was deliberately destroyed. But every name recovered is an act of resistance against erasure. So who are these forgotten thousands? Let me paint you some portraits based on historical patterns and the fragmentary records that survive. She was a midwife in a German village whose name we don't know. She delivered babies for 40 years. When the local male physician wanted to establish himself in the area, he needed to eliminate his competition. He started rumours. Within months she was arrested, tortured, confessed to killing infants through witchcraft, and burned. Her name doesn't appear in any surviving records, but we know she existed because of a property transfer dated 1623 that notes, "House formerly belonging to the witch." She was a 90-year-old woman in a French town. She'd outlived 2 husbands, several children, and most of her generation. She survived on charity from neighbours, which bred resentment. When a child in the village got sick, she was blamed. We know she existed only because a folk song from that region mentions Old Marie, who cursed the mayor's son. We don't know her real name, when she died, or where she's buried. She was an indigenous woman in the Spanish colonies, probably in Peru or Mexico, accused of practicing her traditional religion. The Spanish Inquisition conflated indigenous spiritual practices with witchcraft and diabolism. She was tried, convicted, and executed. Her name was recorded in Spanish as India Maria, which probably wasn't her real name at all, just what the Spanish called her. Her actual name, her language, her story, all lost. She was a woman in England who argued with her neighbour over a property boundary. The neighbour accused her of witchcraft. She was examined, found to have witch marks, moles, and hanged. We know about her case only because it's mentioned in passing in someone else's trial, similar to the case of the woman hanged in Essex last year. No name, no date, just a reference to another forgotten victim. She was a wealthy widow in Italy whose stepchildren wanted her inheritance. They accused her of using witchcraft to kill their father. She was tortured by the Inquisition. We don't know if she survived or not. The record just says she was examined and dealt with appropriately. Her property went to her stepchildren. History doesn't remember her name, but it remembers that her house is now a historic landmark owned by descendants of those stepchildren. Multiply these stories by tens of thousands, across 300 years, across every country in Europe and the colonies, and you begin to grasp the scale of what was done. This wasn't a few isolated cases of medieval superstition. This was systematic, sustained persecution that killed more people than the Spanish Inquisition, more people than the Crusades' violence against European communities, more people than most named genocides in history. And it specifically targeted women. Some scholars call it gynocide, the targeted killing of women as a group. Others call it the Women's Holocaust. These terms are controversial because they seem to minimize other atrocities or create unhelpful comparisons, but the point stands. Between 40,000 and 60,000 people, 80% of them women, were legally murdered over 300 years in a systematic campaign that specifically targeted female knowledge, female autonomy, female visibility, and female survival. And we don't talk about it. Or when we do, we frame it as, oh, those superstitious medieval people, ignoring that most witch executions happened in the early modern period, the 1600s and 1700s, not the Middle Ages. We frame it as religious fanaticism, ignoring the economic and political motives. We frame it as historical curiosity, ignoring that witch accusations and killing still happen today in parts of Africa, Asia, and Papua New Guinea, where thousands of people, mostly women, have been killed in the last few decades. The Church tried to erase these women through execution, through destroyed records, through historical revisionism, through collective amnesia, and for a long time, it worked. When I was growing up, witch trials were presented as quirky historical footnotes. Can you believe people used to think witches were real? How silly! The victims were abstractions, the persecution was minimized, and the systems that enabled it were never examined. But erasure is never complete. Memory persists in unexpected places, in folk songs and local legends, in family oral histories passed down through generations, in the historical records' gaps and silences, because sometimes what's not said is as revealing as what is, in archaeological discoveries of unmarked graves, in old property records that reveal who profited from witch executions, in the DNA of descendants who carry these women's genes even if they don't know their names. And memory persists in the patterns we still see today, when women are told to be quiet, modest, invisible, when female knowledge, whether traditional medicine, folk practices, or simply lived experience, is dismissed in favor of male expertise, when successful women face scrutiny and accusations that their male counterparts never experience, when women who don't conform to expected roles are punished socially, professionally, or legally, when violence against women is normalized, justified, or ignored. These are echoes of the witch trials. The mechanisms haven't disappeared, they've just adapted. So what do we do with this history? How do we honor the forgotten thousands? First, we remember. We say their names when we can. We acknowledge the nameless when we can't. We refuse to let this history be minimized or erased again. Every time someone tries to frame witch trials as harmless superstition or ancient history, we correct them with facts and numbers and the weight of 60,000 deaths. Second, we recognize the patterns. When we see women being targeted for being too loud, too successful, too different, too visible, we name it. We call it out. We don't let modern witch hunting happen unchallenged, whether it's professional persecution, social media pile-ons, or legal harassment designed to silence women. Third, we honour the resistance, because not everyone complied. Some women refused to confess even under torture. Some families risked everything to defend accused women. Some communities refused to cooperate with witch hunters. Some records survived because someone thought, this is wrong, and someday people need to know what really happened. That resistance matters. It's why we have any records at all. It's why we can tell these stories. Fourth, we continue the work. Historians, genealogists, archaeologists, they're still finding new information, recovering lost names, excavating unmarked graves. Support that work. Read it. Share it. Help fund it. Every name recovered is a victory against erasure. And finally, we connect it to now. Because witch hunting didn't end in 1750. It transformed. The accusations changed from consorting with the devil to other charges, but the targeting of women who threaten patriarchal systems continues. Recognizing the historical pattern helps us see the contemporary one. The 11 women we met tonight, Alice, Joan, Isabel, Tituba, Agnes Waterhouse, Anna, Malin, Agnes Sampson, Bridget, Rebecca, and Katharina. They're the ones lucky enough to have names, stories, records, but they stand in for thousands who don't. Every time we remember them, we're also remembering the nameless. Every time we tell their stories, we're fighting the erasure of all the others. The church tried to erase these women. History almost succeeded in forgetting them. But we're still here, you and I, at whatever hour of the night you're listening to this, refusing to let them disappear. That's not nothing. That's resistance. That's memory work. That's justice, however incomplete. As you're drifting off to sleep, I want you to hold this thought. History is not neutral. What we remember and what we forget is chosen, often by people with power protecting their own interests. The fact that we forgot 60,000 women, that their names and stories were deliberately erased, is not an accident. It's the final violence of the witch trials, murder, then erasure, then silence. But silence can be broken, memory can be recovered, stories can be told, and tonight, together, we've done that. We've spent over 2 hours refusing to let these women stay erased. We've witnessed Alice's escape and Petronella's sacrifice. We've stood with Joan at the stake. We've heard Isabel's strange poetry. We've watched Tituba survive impossible circumstances. We've mourned Agnes Waterhouse setting precedent. We've raged against Anna's Enlightenment execution. We've felt Marlin's betrayal. We've witnessed Agnes Sampson's torture. We've seen Bridget's colour. We've recognised Rebecca's breaking point. We've followed Katharina's professional destruction. And we've acknowledged the thousands whose names we'll never know. That's what we do with histories erased. We remember them anyway. We tell their stories anyway. We refuse the silence anyway. And in doing so, we make sure that the systems that killed them can't operate invisibly anymore. We expose the mechanisms, we name the patterns, we honour the dead by protecting the living. Thank you for staying with me through these difficult stories. Thank you for not looking away when it got dark, for not tuning out when it got painful, for caring enough about these women to spend your night learning their names and understanding their deaths. That attention matters. That witness matters. You matter. These stories aren't easy, but they're important. And there are so many more stories to tell, stories of resistance, survival, and the women who shaped history despite everything trying to stop them. If you found value in this journey, If these women's stories moved you or taught you something, or made you see history differently, I hope you'll come back for the next exploration. Because history is full of voices that were silenced, and together we can amplify them again. Sleep well, wherever you are. Dream of a world where women can be powerful, visible, joyful, and successful without fear. Dream of justice for the nameless thousands. And when you wake up, remember their stories. Share them. Let them change how you see the world. Because the best way to honor the dead is to learn from them and to make sure their deaths weren't for nothing. Until next time, good night. And remember, history tried to erase them, but we're still here, still telling their stories, still refusing the silence. That's how memory wins.